Picture this. December 24th, 1895. Christmas Eve. Deep in the mountains of North Carolina, a 33-year-old man stands alone on a stone terrace. Snow dusts the peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance. The air is cold and crisp. Behind him rises a palace. Not a house, a palace. 250 rooms, 65 fireplaces, 43 bathrooms, 4 acres of floor space under a single roof. The largest private residence ever built in the United States of America. This man has just spent 6 years and $6 million building it. That's over $200 million in today's money. 6 years of his life consumed by construction. Thousands of workers, millions of bricks, acres of limestone. And here's what makes your blood run cold when you first learn about it. This wasn't his primary residence. This wasn't where he lived most of the year. This was his vacation home, his weekend retreat, the place he came to relax, to get away from it all, to escape the pressures of New York society. His name was George Washington Vanderbilt II, and in 19 years he would be dead. Dead at 51. From complications following a routine surgery. His widow would be bankrupt, drowning in debts she couldn't pay. And this palace, this $200 million château in the mountains, would be open to the public for $2 admission. $2. Because the family couldn't afford to keep the lights on. Because the operating costs were so crushing that the only way to save it was to turn it into a tourist attraction. But that's not even the shocking part. The shocking part is this. George Vanderbilt was the least greedy, the most modest, the most responsible, the most conscientious of all the Vanderbilts. He didn't throw lavish parties. He didn't race yachts. He didn't gamble fortunes. He spent his money on books and art and conservation. His brothers built bigger mansions. His cousins spent more money. His family, the Vanderbilt family, controlled more wealth than the United States Treasury held in gold reserves. More money than most countries. More power than most governments. And every single one of their mansions was demolished, torn down, razed to the ground, erased from existence. Within 50 years of being built, the Vanderbilt palaces that lined Fifth Avenue in New York were gone, replaced by office buildings and apartment towers, the Newport cottages where they spent their summers. Most of them demolished or donated to preservation societies. The great houses in Chicago, Philadelphia, San Francisco, all gone. But this one survived. This one, the largest of them all, the most expensive, the most elaborate, somehow made it through. And when you understand why, when you see what really happened to the Vanderbilt fortune and where all that money went, you'll realize something that will fundamentally change how you see wealth in America. Change how you understand power. Change how you think about billionaires and inequality and the way our society actually works. Because the billionaires didn't disappear. They didn't become less wealthy. They didn't lose their power, or their influence, or their control. They simply learned to hide. They learned that building palaces makes you a target. That displaying your wealth invites destruction. That monuments to yourself attract lightning. And what they're hiding behind now, what they've built instead of palaces, is far more powerful and far more dangerous than any mansion could ever be. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why this mansion exists and why it's the only one left standing, we need to go back. Way back. Back to a dirt-poor 16-year-old boy on Staten Island who borrowed $100 from his mother. Back to the moment that created the most powerful family fortune in American history. Back to the man they called the Commodore. Back to the beginning of the Vanderbilt dynasty. Because without understanding where this fortune came from, without seeing how it was built, and what it took to create it, You can't possibly understand why it all fell apart so completely. So quickly. So totally. Let me take you back to 1810. To a world that doesn't exist anymore. To an America that would be unrecognizable to us now. Let me show you where it all began. The year is 1810, Staten Island, New York. A teenage boy stands at the water's edge, watching ferry boats cross the harbor. He's barely literate, can read enough to get by, can write his name and do basic mathematics. But that's about it. His father is a struggling farmer trying to work rocky, unproductive land. His family has no money, no connections, no prospects whatsoever. They're poor, not destitute, but poor, living hand to mouth. One bad harvest away from real trouble. But this boy, this 16-year-old kid who can barely read and has never been more than a few miles from home, has noticed something. Something that no one else seems to see. The New York harbor is complete chaos. Dozens of small ferry operators running boats with no real schedules, no reliability. Overcharging passengers one day, undercutting each other the next. Providing terrible service. Boats that break down. Captains who show up late or not at all. Passengers left stranded on docks. It's a mess. Disorganized, inefficient, ripe for someone to come in and do it better. And this boy, staring at those boats, sees an opportunity. An opportunity that will change American history. His name is Cornelius Vanderbilt, and he's about to start building what will become one of the greatest fortunes ever assembled. But he needs money to start. He needs a boat. So he goes to his mother. "Lend me $100, he says. I'll buy a small boat, a periauger. I'll run a ferry service between Staten Island and Manhattan. I'll undercut the competition, provide better service, run on a schedule. I'll make it work, and I'll pay you back." His mother looks at this barely educated teenage boy, looks at his calloused hands and determined eyes, and she thinks he's insane. His father tells him directly that he's wasting her money, that he'll lose it all in 6 months, that he doesn't know anything about running a business, that he should stay on the farm where he belongs. But something in Cornelius's eyes, some quality of absolute certainty, convinces his mother. Against her husband's wishes, against her own better judgment, she gives him the money. $100. In 1810, that's about $3,000 in today's currency. That's it. That's the entire starting capital for what will become the Vanderbilt fortune. 100 borrowed dollars from a poor farmer's wife who probably couldn't afford to lose it. And here's what happens next. Within 1 year, Cornelius has paid his mother back, with interest, every penny, plus extra. Within 2 years, he's saved enough to buy a second boat. Within 5 years, he owns 3 boats and has hired captains to run them while he manages operations. Within 10 years, he controls most of the ferry traffic in New York Harbor. He's gone from a single boat to a fleet, from working for himself to employing dozens of people, from borrowed money to real wealth. Within 20 years, he's a millionaire, an actual millionaire in 1830, when being a millionaire meant something, when there were perhaps a few hundred millionaires in the entire United States. But here's the thing you need to understand about Cornelius Vanderbilt, the thing that explains everything that came after. He wasn't just good at business. He wasn't just smart or hard-working or lucky. He was ruthless, absolutely, completely, utterly without mercy or compassion or any sense of fair play whatsoever. When competitors tried to undercut his prices, to take away his customers, Cornelius would slash his fares so low that he operated at a loss. He would run his boats for months, sometimes years, bleeding money every single day, just to bankrupt his rivals, just to force them out of business. And when they finally collapsed, when they were desperate and broken, and begging him to buy their boats so they could salvage something from their ruined businesses. He would offer them pennies on the dollar, a fraction of what their boats were worth. Take it or leave it. Most took it. Because what choice did they have? And then, once Cornelius owned their boats, once he'd eliminated the competition, he would jack his prices right back up, higher than before, making back all his losses and then some, extracting maximum profit from passengers who now had no alternative. When competitors tried to form alliances against him, tried to band together to resist his predatory tactics, Cornelius would find the weakest member of the alliance, the one struggling most, the one most desperate for cash, and he would approach them privately, secretly, offer them a deal, a generous deal, more than their partnership was worth to them, and they would take it. They would betray their partners, break the alliance, and Cornelius would destroy the rest. When harbor officials tried to regulate him, tried to impose rules about safety or scheduling or pricing, he bribed them. Cash payments. Under the table. Everyone has a price. Find it and pay it. When politicians tried to pass laws restricting his operations, he bought them. Campaign contributions. Personal gifts. Whatever it took. He was utterly shameless about it. The newspapers started calling him the Commodore. The nickname was sarcastic at first, mocking. This uneducated ferryboat captain with his rough manners and crude speech, pretending to be some kind of naval commander, playing at being a gentleman. But Cornelius took the name and owned it, embraced it, started using it himself. And soon, nobody was laughing anymore, because by the time he was 40 years old, by 1840, Cornelius Vanderbilt controlled virtually all shipping in and out of New York Harbor. Not most of it, virtually all of it. If you wanted to move goods or people by water in America's largest and most important city, you paid Vanderbilt. There was no way around him, no alternative, no choice. He had created a monopoly through nothing but raw aggression and relentless competition. He had won. But then something happened. Something that separated Cornelius Vanderbilt from every other rich man in American history. Something that demonstrated a quality that very few people possess. The ability to see the future, to recognize when the world is about to change, and to change with it. Cornelius looked at steamships and railroads, new technologies that were starting to emerge in the 1840s and 50s, and he realized something. Sailing ships were about to become obsolete. The technology that had made his fortune was dying. The future wasn't on water anymore. The future was on rails. And here's where the story gets absolutely insane, where it becomes almost impossible to believe. Cornelius Vanderbilt was 69 years old when he made this realization. 69. An age when most men are retired or dead. An age when people get comfortable and cautious and risk-averse. An age when you consolidate what you have, rather than gambling on something new. Cornelius did the opposite. He looked at everything he'd built over 50 years, looked at his entire shipping empire, every boat and route and wharf, and he made a decision that his family thought was suicide. He sold everything. His entire shipping empire, every boat, every contract, every physical asset he'd spent half a century assembling. And he took all that money, millions and millions of dollars, and he bet it all on something most people thought was a passing fad. A novelty that would never replace traditional shipping. Railroads. His family thought he'd lost his mind, gone senile. His competitors thought he was finished, making the biggest mistake of his career. His friends, the few he had, told him he was throwing away everything he'd built, that he'd die broke. They were all catastrophically, spectacularly wrong. Because Cornelius Vanderbilt looked at American railroads in the 1860s and saw something that nobody else could see. He saw chaos, opportunity, the exact same thing he'd seen in New York Harbor 50 years earlier. The American railroad system was a complete disaster, a mess. There were dozens of small companies, each one running a few miles of track. Different track gauges, so trains from one company couldn't run on another company's tracks. No coordination between companies. No standardization. To ship goods from New York to Chicago, you had to transfer cargo between 6 or 7 different railroad companies. Loading and unloading at every connection, each company charging its own rates, each one causing delays. It was slow, expensive, inefficient, and infuriating for everyone involved. And Cornelius Vanderbilt was going to fix it. Or, more accurately, he was going to own it. He started buying railroad companies, one by one. The New York and Harlem Railroad first, a small line running from Manhattan into Westchester County. Then the Hudson River Railroad, running north along the Hudson. Then the big prize, the New York Central Railroad, which connected New York to Buffalo and the Great Lakes. He borrowed money, issued stock, used every financial tool available. And he bought them all. But here's what made him a genius. Here's what nobody else had thought to do. He connected them, physically connected them. He rebuilt track sections to standardize the gauge. He created transfer points where freight could move seamlessly between lines. He established unified scheduling. And for the first time in American history, goods could travel from New York City to Chicago on a single company's integrated system. Vanderbilt's system. He controlled the prices, every penny. He controlled the schedules, every minute. He controlled the flow of American commerce from the Atlantic coast to the Midwest, the most valuable trade route in the country. And there was absolutely nothing anyone could do about it. He had just created the most powerful monopoly America had ever seen, and the money started pouring in. Not thousands, not hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions. Money on a scale that America had never seen before in private hands. But the scale of what he did next, the sheer audacity of it, is almost impossible to comprehend even now. In 1867, Cornelius got into a dispute with 3 men who controlled a competing railroad, the Erie Railroad. These 3 men were named Jim Fisk, Jay Gould, and Daniel Drew, and they were not businessmen in any conventional sense. They were pirates, fraudsters, con men who'd gotten control of a railroad and were running it like their personal piggy bank, stealing from investors, manipulating stock prices. And when they refused to sell their railroad to Vanderbilt, when they refused to be bought out or pushed out, he declared war. What followed was called the Erie War, and it was unlike anything America had ever seen before, unlike anything in the history of American business. It was warfare, actual warfare conducted with money and lawyers and bribed judges instead of guns. Vanderbilt's strategy was simple. He would buy the Erie Railroad whether they wanted to sell or not. He would purchase stock until he owned a controlling interest. Force the current owners out. Take over. So he started buying. 10,000 shares. 20,000. 50,000. He was pouring millions of dollars into Erie stock, buying up shares as fast as they appeared on the market. And then he noticed something strange, something that didn't make sense. No matter how much stock he bought, the price didn't go up. Supply and demand should have driven the price higher as he bought more. But it wasn't happening. In fact, more shares kept appearing on the market. New shares. Constantly. Where were they coming from? And then Cornelius realized what was happening. And the realization must have been equal parts shock and grudging admiration, because what Fisk, Gould, and Drew were doing was insane, criminal, brilliant. They were printing fake stock certificates, actually printing them. They had a printing press set up in the basement of the Erie Railroad headquarters, and they were creating counterfeit shares, forged stock certificates, and selling them to Vanderbilt as fast as he could buy them. They were literally printing money, stealing from him in the most brazen, outrageous way possible. When Vanderbilt figured it out, he was apoplectic with rage, furious beyond measure. He went to judges he'd bribed over the years and got arrest warrants issued for all three men. Fraud, embezzlement, stock manipulation. The warrants were issued immediately. But Fisk and Gould were one step ahead. They grabbed $6 million in cash from the Erie Railroad accounts, actual physical currency, and they fled, ran across the state line to New Jersey, where New York arrest warrants couldn't reach them, and they holed up in a fortified hotel with hired guards. Armed guards with rifles standing watch 24 hours a day. For months, they ran the Erie Railroad from exile, conducting business from a hotel in New Jersey while Vanderbilt's lawyers tried to figure out how to get them back to New York to face charges. The Erie War finally ended when both sides realized they were spending so much money on bribes and legal fees and security that they might as well just negotiate. They met, worked out a deal. Vanderbilt got some concessions. Fisk and Gould got to keep the railroad. Everyone walked away. But here's the important part, the part that matters for understanding what came next. Vanderbilt lost that battle. He spent millions trying to take over the Erie Railroad and failed. He lost, but he didn't care, at all. Because while everyone was focused on the Erie War, while the newspapers were covering every dramatic development, and the public was scandalized by the corruption and fraud, Cornelius Vanderbilt was quietly buying every other railroad around New York, every other company, every competing line. And by the time people realized what had happened, by the time they looked up from the Erie drama and saw what he'd been doing, it was too late. He owned them all. The Erie War had been a distraction, a sideshow. While everyone watched his left hand, his right hand had been working. And now Cornelius Vanderbilt controlled the arteries of American commerce. Every rail line in and out of the largest city in America, every major route to the Midwest. If you wanted to ship anything to New York, you paid Vanderbilt. If you wanted to ship anything from New York, you paid Vanderbilt. If you wanted your products to reach American markets, you paid Vanderbilt. There was no alternative, no competition, no choice whatsoever. And the money absolutely poured in. When Cornelius Vanderbilt died on January 4th, 1877, at age 82, his estate was valued at $105 million. $105 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $2.5 billion today. Which sounds like a lot, which is a lot. But that number doesn't mean anything. It doesn't capture anything important. Because it doesn't show the scale of his wealth relative to the American economy, relative to the country as a whole. So let me give you a number that does mean something. $105 million in 1877 represented 1/87th of the entire United States gross domestic product. 1/87th of everything, every good produced. Every service performed, every dollar of economic activity in the entire country. Cornelius Vanderbilt personally owned 1/87th of all of it. Think about what that means. If someone had that same proportion of wealth today, if someone owned 1/87th of America's GDP right now, they wouldn't be worth $50 billion. They wouldn't be worth $100 billion. They wouldn't be worth $200 billion. They would be worth over $300 billion. 3 Elon Musks, 4 Jeff Bezoses. Cornelius Vanderbilt was, proportionally, one of the richest human beings who has ever lived, richer than Rockefeller at his peak, richer than Carnegie, richer than any tech billionaire, richer, in proportional terms, than anyone in the modern world. But now comes the decision that would change everything. The decision that set in motion the events that would lead to Biltmore. The decision that would ultimately destroy the entire fortune within 3 generations. A decision that Cornelius thought would preserve his dynasty forever. Cornelius Vanderbilt had 13 children, 8 daughters and 5 sons. And when he sat down to write his will, when he decided how to distribute the greatest fortune America had ever seen, he made a choice that shocked everyone. He essentially disowned 12 of his 13 children. He left them token amounts, a few $100,000 each, which wasn't nothing. It was more money than most Americans would see in their lifetimes. But it wasn't the real fortune. It wasn't real power. The vast bulk of his wealth, $95 million out of $105 million, went to just one son, William Henry Vanderbilt. 90% of everything to one child. Why? Why would he do this? Why cut out 12 of his children and give everything to one? Because Cornelius believed something absolutely. Believed it with every fiber of his being. The fortune had to stay concentrated. Had to remain in strong hands. In one person's control. If he divided it 13 ways, it would be diluted. Weakened. Scattered. Each child would get roughly $8 million. Still wealthy, but not powerful. Not dominant. Not enough to control industries and bend markets and shape the economy. The fortune would be split up and spent on mansions and yachts and parties, wasted by children who hadn't fought for it, who didn't understand what it took to build it, who didn't have his ruthless determination. Within a generation or two, it would be gone. Dissipated. But if he gave it all to one son, if he kept it concentrated, then the Vanderbilt fortune could remain the Vanderbilt fortune, could stay dominant, could be a dynasty, could last forever. And William Henry had proven himself, proven that he understood business. His father had put him in charge of a failing railroad division years earlier, and William had turned it around. Made it profitable through competence and hard work and shrewd decision-making. He was serious, responsible. He understood how wealth worked. He wouldn't waste it. So William got everything, $95 million. And then something extraordinary happened, something that seemed to prove that Cornelius had made exactly the right choice. William doubled it. In just 8 years, between 1877 and 1885, William Henry Vanderbilt took his father's $105 million fortune and turned it into $200 million. He didn't just preserve it, he grew it, expanded it, made it even more powerful. By 1885, William Henry Vanderbilt was without question the richest man in America, possibly the richest man in the world. And the money was coming in so fast, growing so rapidly, that it almost didn't seem real. Listen to this number. William Henry Vanderbilt was earning $10 million per year in passive income, just from investments and railroad profits. $10 million per year. In the 1880s. That's equivalent to about $300 million annually in today's money. Money that just appeared in his accounts automatically. Without him doing anything, without him working, just returns on capital. Interest and dividends and railroad profits flowing in like a river. He was making more money per year than most countries, more than the annual budgets of most American states. The fortune seemed unstoppable, permanent, eternal. But William Henry Vanderbilt was watching his children grow up in this world of unimaginable wealth. And he was terrified, genuinely terrified, because they were growing up in a world their grandfather never knew, a world of effortless luxury, a world where money appeared magically without anyone having to work for it. His children had never struggled, never fought, never had to prove themselves. They'd been born into the wealthiest family in America. They'd grown up in mansions with servants. They'd never worried about money because money was simply everywhere, limitless, inexhaustible. And William could see what it was doing to them. His sons were competing to build the biggest mansions on Fifth Avenue, spending millions on houses that served no purpose except to outdo each other. His daughters were throwing parties that made newspapers, costume balls that cost more than most Americans earned in their entire lives. The family was becoming a spectacle, a circus. The newspapers loved it. Every Vanderbilt party, every new mansion, every scandalous story made headlines, and the public was starting to turn against them, starting to resent this obscene display of wealth. There was a moment, a single moment that captured everything that was going wrong. That showed how the public was starting to see the Vanderbilts. A newspaper reporter approached William Henry Vanderbilt one day, asked him a simple question. A question about the railroads. "Mr. Vanderbilt," the reporter asked, "do you run the New York Central Railroad for the public benefit?" It was a loaded question. The reporter was trying to get William to admit that he cared about public service, about helping people, about something other than profit. And William, who was exhausted and frustrated and sick of pretending, gave an answer that would haunt the family for generations. "The public be damned," he said. "I'm working for my stockholders." 4 words, "the public be damned," and the newspapers exploded. Here was the richest man in America openly admitting that he didn't care about ordinary people, that he was only interested in making money, that the public welfare meant nothing to him. Cartoons appeared showing William as a bloated robber baron, a fat man in expensive clothes, crushing workers under his heel, smoking cigars, counting money. The Vanderbilt name, which had once commanded respect, maybe even fear, now represented something darker, something the public was starting to hate. Greed, excess, callousness, disregard for anyone who wasn't wealthy. William saw what was happening, saw the mob forming, and he was smart enough to be afraid. He saw labor strikes turning violent. He saw politicians proposing regulations on the railroads, saw proposals for income taxes, for wealth taxes, for breaking up monopolies. He saw the public mood turning against the super wealthy. And he knew something his father hadn't understood. The world was changing. The era of unrestrained wealth was ending. So, when William Henry Vanderbilt died in 1885, at age 64, his will did something different from his father's. He split the fortune, not evenly among his 8 children, but he split it. His 2 oldest sons, Cornelius II and William K., got the bulk of it, about $40 million each, enough to continue controlling the railroads, enough to maintain real power. But his other children, including his youngest son George, each received $10 million. $10 million each. Still enormous wealth. Still more money than they could possibly spend. But not the concentrated, overwhelming fortune that Cornelius had left to William. The dynasty was starting to fragment. And George Washington Vanderbilt II, who was 23 years old when his father died in 1885, who suddenly had $10 million and absolutely no idea what to do with it, was about to make a choice that would shock his entire family. A choice that would create Biltmore. A choice that would be both the most responsible and the most financially ruinous decision any Vanderbilt ever made. But to understand why George did what he did, why he spent $6 million building a palace in the mountains of North Carolina, you need to understand something about him, about who he was, about how different he was from everyone else in his family. Because George Vanderbilt wasn't like his brothers, wasn't like his cousins, wasn't like anyone else who carried that name. And that difference would determine everything that came next. George Washington Vanderbilt II was born on November 14, 1862, in a mansion on Staten Island. By the time he could walk, by the time he had conscious memories, his family was already unimaginably wealthy. His father William was running the railroad empire. The money was pouring in faster than they could spend it. By the time George was 10 years old, his father was the richest man in America. The Vanderbilt name appeared in newspapers constantly, always in the society pages, always describing some party or some new mansion or some extravagant purchase. And George, from a very young age, hated it. Not the money itself. He never rejected wealth, never pretended to be poor or middle class. But he hated the attention, the performance, the constant competition within his own family. His older brothers, Cornelius and William, were already competing even as teenagers, competing over everything. Who had better horses? Who threw better parties? Who was more popular in society? As they got older, as they inherited their fortunes, the competition intensified. Cornelius built a massive mansion on Fifth Avenue, 130 rooms, a ballroom that could hold 1,200 guests. It cost $3 million. William saw it and immediately started planning something bigger. He built an even more elaborate mansion right next door, then added Marble House in Newport, a summer cottage that cost $11 million. For a summer house, a place they used maybe 8 weeks per year. George's cousins were just as bad, racing yachts that cost fortunes, betting enormous sums on horse races, throwing costume balls that made international news, living like European royalty, acting like American nobility. And the newspapers followed them everywhere, documented every excess, every scandal, every ridiculous display of wealth, published drawings of their mansions, descriptions of their parties, estimates of how much everything cost. The Vanderbilts had become America's most famous family, the most talked about, the most watched, and definitely not in a good way. The public was starting to hate them, to resent them, to use the Vanderbilt name as shorthand for everything wrong with American wealth inequality. But George wanted nothing to do with any of it. While his brothers competed to throw the most elaborate parties, George disappeared into libraries, into books, into a world of ideas that had nothing to do with society or wealth or competition. By age 12, he was reading in French, German, and Italian. Not just reading literature, philosophy, history. By 16, he'd taught himself Spanish and Portuguese. By 18, he was studying ancient Greek and Latin, translating classical texts for his own education. By his early 20s, his personal library contained over 20,000 volumes. Books in 8 languages, first editions, rare manuscripts, philosophy, architecture, art, history, forestry, agricultural science. George devoured knowledge the way his brothers devoured luxury, the way his cousins consumed parties and yachts and horses. His family thought he was strange. His father worried he was too soft for business, too intellectual, too refined, not ruthless enough, not aggressive enough. His brothers called him big boring, said he was wasting his life, said he should be out in society, meeting people, making connections, building the family name. But George didn't care what they thought. He was genuinely happier alone in a library than at any party, more interested in a first edition book than in the most expensive yacht, more excited by architecture than by any social competition. And there was something else happening, something George was doing that his family didn't fully understand. He was traveling, extensively, through Europe, staying at great estates, walking through the gardens of Versailles, touring the château of the Loire Valley in France, visiting the great country houses of England, studying Italian villas and German castles. He wasn't traveling as a tourist. He was studying, learning, taking notes, understanding how great estates worked, how they were designed, how they were managed, what made them beautiful, what made them sustainable. And slowly, gradually, George was forming a vision, an idea, a plan. He was going to build something, not in New York where his brothers were building, not in Newport, where the social competition was endless and exhausting. Somewhere else, somewhere remote, somewhere he could create something permanent, something meaningful, something that would matter, something that would outlast the parties and the gossip and the newspaper headlines that he hated so much. In 1888, George visited Asheville, North Carolina. He was 26 years old. Doctors had recommended the trip. The mountain air, they said, would be good for his chronic respiratory problems. He'd had lung issues since childhood. Nothing life-threatening, but chronic coughs and breathing difficulties. The clean mountain air was supposed to help. So George went, took the train south. The town of Asheville sat in a valley surrounded by the Blue Ridge Mountains. The scenery was absolutely spectacular. Mountains rising in every direction, forests covering the slopes, the French Broad River winding through the valley. The climate was temperate, cool in summer, mild in winter. Nothing like the humid heat of summer in New York. And the land was cheap, incredibly cheap. This was the American South in the 1880s, still recovering from the Civil War. The economy was depressed. Agriculture was struggling. Farmers were barely surviving on exhausted soil. They were desperate to sell, desperate for cash. And George saw something nobody else could see. He saw his château. He stood on a ridge overlooking thousands of acres of forest and farmland. And in his mind, he saw what could be there. A French Renaissance palace rising from the mountainside, gardens descending in terraces, forests managed scientifically, farms demonstrating modern techniques, a complete, self-sufficient estate. Not just a house, an entire world. And he had the money to build it. $10 million from his father's estate. He could spend $6 million on construction and still have $4 million left over. He could do this. He could actually build the estate he'd been envisioning for years. George started buying land. Immediately. He didn't wait, didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess himself. He started approaching farmers, making offers, paying cash, fair prices, sometimes generous prices. And the land came quickly. At first, a few hundred acres, then 1,000, then 5,000. Local farmers were baffled. Rumors spread. Why was this wealthy New Yorker buying up every farm and forest tract around Asheville? Some thought he was building a hospital, some kind of massive medical facility. Others said it was a government project, secret military installation. Nobody guessed the truth, because the truth was crazier than any rumor. By 1889, George Washington Vanderbilt had purchased 125,000 acres. 125,000. That's 196 square miles. An area larger than the city of Philadelphia, larger than many European principalities. George Vanderbilt, at age 27, personally owned an area the size of a small country. And right in the center of it, on a ridge overlooking the French Broad River, with views of the Blue Ridge Mountains in every direction, he was going to build his palace, his château, his masterpiece. But here's what makes George's vision so extraordinary, so fundamentally different from everything his brothers and cousins were doing. He wasn't building a house to show off, wasn't building to compete, wasn't trying to outdo anyone or impress society or get his name in newspapers. He was building a complete, self-sufficient world, an estate with forests that would be managed scientifically using principles that didn't even fully exist yet. Farms that would use modern techniques to restore exhausted southern soil. A village for workers with decent housing and fair wages and schools for their children. This wasn't ego. This wasn't ostentation. This was something else. Something closer to a utopian experiment. A progressive vision of what a great estate could be. George believed, genuinely believed, that enormous wealth carried enormous responsibility. That land should be managed sustainably for future generations. That a great estate should serve and benefit the community around it, not just the owner. That money could and should be used to demonstrate better ways of doing things. His brothers were building monuments to themselves, palaces designed to display their wealth and empower. George was trying to build something that mattered, something that would contribute, something that would teach and demonstrate and preserve. And to make this vision real, to turn this idea into stone and wood and living forest, George needed to hire the two best men in America, the best architect, the best landscape designer. Men who could match his ambition, Men who could understand his vision. Men who would take him seriously, even though he was just 26 years old. The first was Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt was 60 years old in 1888, the most famous and respected architect in America. Perhaps the only American architect with genuine international reputation. He'd studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the most prestigious architecture school in the world. He'd designed the pedestal for the Statue of Liberty, the base that the statue stands on. He'd built mansions for the Astors, the Belmonts, several other Vanderbilts. He understood grand scale, classical proportion, European elegance translated to American ambition. He was classically trained, obsessively detailed, and very, very expensive. When George approached him in 1888 with this project, Hunt was initially skeptical. Not another Vanderbilt mansion, not another Newport cottage. He'd built several already. They were fine projects, good work, but they were all essentially the same. Display pieces, status symbols, enormous houses that the owners used a few weeks per year. But when George started describing what he wanted, describing his actual vision, Hunt's interest sparked. This wasn't going to be just another mansion. This was going to be a true French Renaissance château, authentic, serious, modeled after 3 specific castles that George had studied extensively in France: Blois, Chenonceau, and Chambord. The scale would be unprecedented in America. Nothing built in the United States had ever approached this size or ambition for a private residence. The attention to detail would be absolute. Every element designed and crafted to last centuries. And the budget, George made very clear, was essentially unlimited. $6 million allocated. More if needed. Whatever it took to do it right. Hunt agreed. How could he not? This was the kind of project architects dream about. Unlimited budget. Sophisticated client who actually understood architecture. Location that offered natural beauty and privacy. This would be his masterpiece. The project that would define his career. The second man George needed was Frederick Law Olmsted. And if you don't recognize that name immediately, you absolutely should. Olmsted designed Central Park in Manhattan, Prospect Park in Brooklyn, the grounds of the United States Capitol in Washington, parks in Boston, Chicago, dozens of American cities. He had literally invented the profession of landscape architecture in America, created it from nothing. Before Olmsted, there were gardeners and farmers. After Olmsted, there were landscape architects, people who thought about land as something that could be designed and shaped and managed at massive scale. He was 66 years old in 1888, semi-retired, living in Massachusetts, taking on only a few select projects. He'd seen everything, done everything, built his reputation and his legacy. He wasn't particularly interested in taking on another massive project, but George convinced him. Not with money, though George offered plenty, with the vision. George explained what he wanted to do, not just landscape around a house, transform an entire landscape, 125,000 acres, most of it exhausted farmland and logged-out forests. Restore it, reforest it using scientific forestry principles that were just being developed. Create sustainable timber operations that would prove forests could be harvested profitably while improving over time. Establish model farms that would demonstrate modern agricultural techniques to struggling southern farmers. Turn this entire property into a working demonstration of how land could and should be managed. Olmsted was intrigued, more than intrigued, fascinated. This wasn't just designing a garden around another rich person's mansion. This was designing an entire landscape, a complete ecosystem, a working, productive, sustainable environment that would last for generations. This was landscape architecture at a scale even he had never attempted. This was revolutionary. He agreed, and in 1889, construction began. But what nobody realized yet, not George, not Hunt, not Olmsted, not anyone involved in this project, was just how massive this was about to become, just how much money it would consume, just how long it would take, just how many complications would arise, just how impossible it would be to maintain, and just how quickly the world that made this possible was about to end forever. Let me show you what they built, because even now, even knowing everything that happened afterward, even understanding that this project nearly destroyed George financially, even seeing how it all fell apart, what they created remains one of the most extraordinary achievements in American architectural history. Nothing like it had been built before. Nothing like it will ever be built again. Construction on Biltmore House began in 1889, and the first thing they had to do, before they could even think about building the house itself, tells you everything you need to know about the scale of what George was attempting. They had to build a railroad, not a connection, not a spur line, an entire 3-mile private railroad from the construction site to the Southern Railway main line, because the amount of materials needed was so vast, so continuous, so absolutely enormous, that it couldn't possibly be transported by wagon. Think about that for a moment. Really let it sink in. Before George could build his house, he had to build railroad infrastructure just to supply the construction site, had to lay tracks, build bridges, create sidings for loading and unloading. This was infrastructure construction before the main construction could even begin. Then they built a brick kiln. Right there on the property, a full industrial kiln for firing bricks. Because George wanted certain walls to be brick, wanted specific colors and textures, and he wanted them made right there, on site, under his control. So they built a brick-making operation, dug clay from the estate, formed bricks, fired them, produced thousands and thousands of bricks that would go into the house. Then they brought in stonemasons, but not local workers, not people from Asheville or anywhere in North Carolina, master craftsmen from Europe, from Italy, France, England, men who'd worked on cathedrals, men who'd trained for years learning techniques that dated back to medieval Europe, men who understood how to carve Indiana limestone into gargoyles and decorative scrollwork and architectural details so fine that they seem impossible even today. These craftsmen had to be recruited, brought to America, transported to rural North Carolina, housed, fed, paid wages that would convince them to leave Europe and work in what was essentially wilderness. At the peak of construction, and I want you to really hear this number, over 1,000 workers were on site, 1,000, in 1890, in rural North Carolina. This was one of the largest private construction projects in American history, larger than most government projects of the era, larger than many industrial facilities. 1,000 people working on a single house, and it would take 6 years, 6 full years of continuous construction. Richard Morris Hunt was obsessive about every single detail, obsessive in a way that would drive most clients insane. But George loved it, encouraged it, wanted that level of care and precision. The limestone came from Indiana, quarried specifically for this project. It had to be a specific type, a specific color that Hunt had selected. Quarried, cut into massive blocks, transported by rail over 1,000 miles to North Carolina, then carved on site. The oak for the grand staircase came from the estate's own forests. But not just any oak, trees that Olmsted selected personally. Walking through the forest, examining trees, choosing specific specimens based on size, grain, color. They were cut in winter when the sap was down, when the wood would be most stable. Aged for 2 years in controlled conditions, then milled to precise specifications and carved by craftsmen who understood fine woodwork. Every single piece of wood in that staircase, every baluster and handrail and tread, was grown, cut, aged, milled, and finished on the property. The roof tiles were slate, but not American slate, imported slate from quarries that Hunt had personally inspected in Europe. The color had to be exactly right. The thickness had to match his specifications. Tens of thousands of individual slate tiles, each one cut to size, shipped across the Atlantic, transported by rail to North Carolina, then hand-installed by craftsmen who understood roofing techniques that most American builders had never seen. The ironwork throughout the house, every hinge, every door handle, every decorative element, All of it was custom-made. Nothing was mass-produced. Nothing came from a catalog. Nothing was ordinary. Blacksmiths working on site, forging iron by hand, creating pieces that were both functional and beautiful. But while Hunt was building the château, Olmsted was attempting something even more ambitious, even more unprecedented. He was reshaping an entire mountain landscape. Remember, George had purchased 125,000 acres, and most of it was a disaster. A wreck, worn-out farmland, soil exhausted from decades of tobacco and cotton farming with no crop rotation, no fertilization, no care for long-term sustainability. Forests that had been logged out, cut for timber with no replanting, no management. The land was eroding, gullying, in some places, literally washing away. Streams were choked with sediment. Topsoil was gone. In Olmsted's words when he first saw it, the land was dying. But Olmsted saw potential, saw what it could be. And he began the largest private reforestation project in American history. Millions of trees were planted, and not randomly, carefully, scientifically. Different species in different locations based on soil type, elevation, water availability. Creating forests that would be stable and sustainable and productive. Forests that could be harvested without being destroyed. And to manage this properly, to ensure that the forestry operation would actually work, would actually demonstrate what George wanted to demonstrate, they needed someone special. They needed the best forester in America. They needed someone who understood scientific forestry, even though that field barely existed yet in the United States. So George hired Gifford Pinchot. Pinchot was 27 years old, fresh from studying forestry in Europe, where the science was more advanced. He would later become the first chief of the United States Forest Service. He's now considered the father of American conservation. His face is on Mount Rushmore of environmental history. But in 1892, he was just a young man with revolutionary ideas. Ideas about managing forests sustainably, about selective harvesting, about protecting watersheds, about thinking generations ahead. Together, George Vanderbilt and Gifford Pinchot created something completely unprecedented in the United States. The first scientifically managed forest in America. The first place where timber was harvested based on data and planning, rather than just cutting whatever was profitable immediately. Trees were marked for selective harvesting, only mature trees. Only in areas where harvesting wouldn't cause erosion or damage watersheds. New growth was protected. Seedlings were planted. Controlled burns were used to reduce undergrowth and prevent catastrophic wildfires. This wasn't just about making the land pretty. Wasn't about creating a scenic backdrop for the house. This was proving that forests could be harvested for profit while actually improving over time. That careful management could enhance land rather than exhausting it. That you could make money from timber while leaving the forest healthier for future generations. This was revolutionary, and it influenced national forest policy for decades. The techniques developed at Biltmore became the basis for how America manages public forests. Meanwhile, closer to the house, Olmsted was designing gardens. And not simple gardens. Not a few flower beds around the house. Complete, elaborate, multi-acre garden systems. He created a 4-acre walled garden modeled after English country estates. Brick walls enclosing geometric beds, fountains, statuary, seasonal plantings that would provide color and interest year-round, a shrub garden with specimens collected from around the world, rhododendrons from Asia, azaleas from Japan, plants that had to be carefully acclimated to North Carolina's climate, an azalea garden that would explode with color in spring, a massive lawn, several acres, that swept down from the house toward distant mountain views, kept immaculately maintained, mowed by crews with manual mowers, since power mowers didn't exist yet, and a conservatory, a massive greenhouse, 34,000 square feet of glass and iron, climate-controlled, heated in winter, where George could grow orchids from South America, tropical plants from Africa, exotic specimens that had no business surviving in North Carolina. The conservatory alone was an engineering marvel. Glass panels fitted precisely, steel framework designed to support the weight while letting in maximum light, heating systems that could maintain tropical temperatures even in winter. This was technology at the absolute cutting edge of what was possible in the 1890s. But all of this, the forests, the gardens, the landscape work, the château itself, all of this was just the beginning. Because George wasn't just building a house and gardens. He was building a complete working estate. He built a dairy, and not a simple barn with a few cows. A state-of-the-art dairy facility. He imported Jersey cows from the Isle of Jersey in the English Channel. Jersey cows produce milk with higher butterfat content. Richer, better for making butter and cream and cheese. He built a modern dairy facility with stainless steel equipment, refrigeration, sanitary conditions that were revolutionary for the time. The dairy produced milk, butter, and cheese not just for consumption at the house, for sale in Asheville, for sale to tourists who came to the area, demonstrating that quality dairy operations were possible and profitable in the South. He built farms, extensive farms, 350 acres of productive farmland, growing vegetables, grain, hay, fruit, using modern farming techniques, crop rotation, scientific fertilization, irrigation systems, again, not just feeding the house, demonstrating to local farmers who were struggling with exhausted soil and outdated techniques, that Southern agriculture could be restored and modernized, making the estate a teaching operation, a working demonstration of progressive agriculture. He built a village, Biltmore Village, not a camp or a collection of shacks, an actual planned village, cottages for workers. Not tiny, not cramped, decent houses with multiple rooms, running water, modern for the time, a church, All Souls Episcopal. George didn't just fund it, he helped design it himself, studied church architecture, worked with Hunt on the plans. Beautiful, elegant, still standing today. A school for workers' children, not just a one-room schoolhouse, a proper school with trained teachers, curriculum, books, giving workers' children educational opportunities they would never have had otherwise. And in Asheville, George funded a hospital. Personally, quietly. He didn't publicize it, didn't want recognition or publicity, just provided the money because the region needed it. This wasn't exploitation in the way Gilded Age wealth usually worked. George wasn't squeezing workers for maximum profit, wasn't treating them as disposable. He paid higher wages than any other employer in the region, provided health care before that was standard, educated workers' children, treated workers with dignity and respect that was almost unheard of in the 1890s. He believed in something we'd now call corporate social responsibility or enlightened capitalism, though those terms wouldn't be invented for another 50 years. He believed that if you had enormous wealth, you had enormous responsibility, that you should use that wealth to improve conditions for everyone, not just yourself, that a great estate should benefit the community around it. And at the center of all of this, rising stone by stone, room by room, day by day for 6 full years, the château was being built. And as it took shape, as the walls rose and the roof went on, and the interior work began, the scale was becoming clear. And it was staggering. Absolutely staggering. The house would have 250 rooms. Let me say that again. 250 rooms. Not 24, not 50. 250. 35 bedrooms. 43 bathrooms. 65 fireplaces. 4 floors above ground. A full basement the size of most mansions. The banquet hall alone was 70 feet long, with a 70-foot-high barrel-vaulted ceiling. You could fit an entire normal-sized house inside just that one room. A single room. The pipe organ in the banquet hall had been custom-built by hand in Philadelphia. One of the finest instruments in America, thousands of pipes, rich, powerful sound that could fill that enormous space. The library was 2 stories tall. Floor-to-ceiling walnut paneling, hand-carved. The walls were covered in wood. The ceiling was covered in wood. Everything rich, dark walnut. And the ceiling. The ceiling was a work of art in itself, a painted masterpiece by Italian artist Giovanni Antonio Pellegrini, created in 1720 for a palazzo in Venice. George had discovered it in his travels, purchased it, had it carefully removed panel by panel, each panel documented, numbered, wrapped for shipping, transported across the Atlantic Ocean, then reassembled in North Carolina by specialists who understood how to handle centuries-old painted plaster. This wasn't decoration. This was museum-quality art installed in a private library. And the books. George's collection of over 20,000 volumes now had a proper home. A home worthy of them. First editions. Rare manuscripts. Books in 8 languages. Leather-bound. Organized by subject and language. This wasn't showing off. George actually read these books, studied them, spent hours in this library every single day when he was in residence. This was a scholar's library, a researcher's library, a working collection. But here's what made Biltmore truly revolutionary for its time. What separated it from every other mansion being built. The technology. Because this is 1895 we're talking about. Most of America is still using oil lamps for lighting. Many homes, even wealthy homes, still have outhouses. Indoor plumbing is a luxury. But Biltmore had electricity throughout. Every single room wired. Hundreds of light fixtures. Chandeliers. Sconces. Reading lamps. All electric. And the power came from the estate's own generator. George had built a hydroelectric dam on a stream on the property. Water-powered generator producing electricity. The house was completely independent from any electrical grid because electrical grids barely existed yet. This was cutting-edge technology in 1895. It had central heating, a massive system of boilers in the basement, coal-fired, producing steam, miles of copper pipes carrying steam throughout the house, radiators in every major room. The entire house could be kept warm in winter. Not with fireplaces that only heated the room they were in. With an integrated heating system. This was revolutionary for the time. It had indoor plumbing, hot and cold running water, 43 bathrooms. In 1895, when most Americans still used chamber pots and outdoor privies, Biltmore had 43 bathrooms with modern fixtures. Toilets, sinks, bathtubs. Some bathrooms had both bathtubs and separate showers. Multiple bathrooms had multiple sinks. The scale of the plumbing system alone was extraordinary. The house had refrigeration, and not ice boxes that required daily ice delivery. Actual mechanical refrigeration using ammonia compression technology. Walk-in coolers in the basement. Temperature controlled. This was science fiction technology for the time. Most wealthy homes would get refrigeration in the 1920s. Biltmore had it in 1895. It had a fire suppression system, early fire detection, fire extinguishers throughout. A fire brigade of trained staff who knew how to respond. This was one of the first private homes in America with organized fire safety systems. It had telephones, an internal telephone system connecting different parts of the house. 40 phones total, throughout the house. You could be in the library on the second floor and pick up a phone and call the kitchen in the basement. Or the stables outside, or the greenhouse, or Olmsted's office in the gardens. In 1895, when most homes didn't have a single telephone, when telephone service was a luxury available only in cities, Biltmore had an internal phone system with 40 extensions. And in the basement, which was really more like an underground palace, more like a complete separate facility, there was something that still seems impossible when you see it. An indoor swimming pool. 70,000 gallons of water. The walls were covered in tile imported from Europe. The ceiling was tiled. Decorated. Beautiful. The water was heated. Heated swimming pool in 1895. Electric lights illuminated it. You could swim at night. In heated water. Underground. In the mountains of North Carolina. In 1895. Let that sink in. Next to the pool, a bowling alley. Full size. Modern lanes. Equipment imported from manufacturers who specialized in gentlemen's bowling facilities. A gymnasium with equipment for physical culture. medicine balls, Indian clubs, weight training equipment, parallel bars, everything needed for a comprehensive workout. This was 50 years before most American homes would have a television. 70 years before home gyms would become common. But George Vanderbilt had a heated indoor pool, a bowling alley, and a gymnasium in his basement in 1895. But here's the thing that really captures the scale, really shows how enormous this operation was. The servants' quarters. Because running a house this size required an army. An actual army of people working full-time. At any given time, Biltmore employed 80 to 100 servants, living on site, maids cleaning rooms, footmen serving meals, cooks preparing food, butlers managing staff, gardeners maintaining the grounds, stable hands caring for horses, engineers running the power plant and heating systems, laundresses washing linens, seamstresses repairing clothing. This was a full-time workforce of nearly 100 people, and they all lived on the estate. The servants' quarters occupied the entire 4th floor of the house, plus sections of the 3rd floor and basement. Small rooms, not luxurious, but decent. Clean, better than most housing available to working-class people at the time. And here's a number that captures everything. The servants' quarters had 43 bathrooms. 43. Just for the staff. More bathrooms than most mansions had total rooms. The kitchen facilities were equally enormous. The main kitchen could prepare meals for 100 people, industrial-scale stoves, multiple workstations, separate pastry kitchen for desserts and breads, a rotisserie room where entire animals could be roasted on spits over open flames, a walk-in freezer using ammonia refrigeration, massive ice boxes, even though they had mechanical refrigeration, as backup. A scullery for washing dishes with industrial-scale sinks and drying racks. This wasn't a kitchen. This was a restaurant operation, a hotel operation, inside a private home. This wasn't just a house, wasn't just a mansion. This was a completely self-contained world, a palace, an estate, a village, a working demonstration of what enlightened wealth combined with progressive ideas could create. And on Christmas Eve, 1895, 6 years after construction began, George Washington Vanderbilt opened the doors for the first time. Snow dusted the peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. The 3-mile approach road wound through the planned forest that Olmsted had created, building anticipation, revealing carefully designed views, before suddenly emerging at the top of the ridge. And there it was, the château, rising from its terraced hillside. 4 stories of Indiana limestone, steep slate roofs, elaborate chimneys, stone carving covering the facade. It looked like something that had been transported whole from France, like a Loire Valley chateau had somehow appeared in the American mountains. Inside, electric lights blazed in every room. Fires burned in dozens of the 65 fireplaces. The banquet hall table was set for Christmas dinner, beneath that soaring 70-foot ceiling. Place settings for family. Crystal, silver, linens. The library shelves stretched 2 stories high, filled with 20,000 leather-bound books. The winter garden bloomed with tropical plants beneath glass skylights 3 stories above. Palm trees reached toward the ceiling. Orchids bloomed in December in North Carolina. It was perfect. Complete. Everything George had envisioned for 6 years had become real, and it had cost $6 million. Over $200 million in today's money. The largest, most expensive, most elaborate, most technologically advanced private residence ever built in America. George was 33 years old. He had achieved something no American had ever attempted. He had built a French Renaissance palace in the mountains. He had proven that American wealth could create something that rivaled anything in Europe. He had established a working estate that served its community. He had demonstrated that forests could be managed sustainably and profitably. He should have been triumphant, should have been celebrating, should have been proud. But standing there on that Christmas Eve, looking at what he'd created, George Vanderbilt had absolutely no idea that he'd just made a catastrophic financial mistake. Had no idea that the world that made Biltmore possible was already dying. Had no idea that within 20 years everything would change. The tax system would change. The economy would change. Public attitudes toward wealth would change, and this palace would nearly be lost forever. But George didn't know any of that yet. For now, on that Christmas Eve in 1895, Biltmore was perfect. And for a few years, for a few brief years, it would be exactly what George dreamed it could be. A refuge, a center of learning, a place of beauty and culture. Let me show you what those years were like, because they mattered. They mattered more than George could have known. For the first 3 years after Biltmore opened, George Washington Vanderbilt lived there mostly alone. Just him, 80 servants, and 250 rooms echoing with emptiness. He would spend months at a time in residence, never going to New York, rarely traveling, just living in his mountain palace, days spent in the library, reading, hours upon hours surrounded by his 20,000 books, reading philosophy in Greek, French novels in the original language, German technical manuals about forestry, history books about the great estates of Europe, evenings riding through the forests on horseback, following trails that Olmsted had designed, watching the sun set over the Blue Ridge Mountains, seeing the forests that he and Gifford Pinchot were managing scientifically, watching them grow healthier, denser, more beautiful. Mornings walking through the gardens as they matured, as Olmsted's vision became reality. Watching seasonal changes, spring azaleas blooming in explosions of pink and white, summer roses filling the walled garden, fall leaves turning the mountains into a tapestry of red and gold, winter snow dusting everything with crystalline silence. George was, by all contemporary accounts, happy. Genuinely happy in a way he'd never been in New York or Newport. Away from his family's endless competition. Away from the newspaper scrutiny that he hated. Away from society's demands and expectations. Here, in the mountains, surrounded by beauty that he'd created, by a working estate that was actually functioning as he'd envisioned, he could finally be himself. Could live according to his own values, could pursue his own interests without judgment or comparison. But in 1898, 3 years after the house opened, everything changed in the best possible way. George married. Her name was Edith Stuyvesant Dresser, and she was perfect for him in ways that are rare and precious. She came from an old, established New York family, not Vanderbilt wealthy, not anywhere close, but old money. Respected lineage going back generations. The kind of family that had social standing not because of wealth, but because of history. And Edith was different from most women of her class. Most women in high society were educated just enough to be good conversationalists at dinner parties, taught French so they could read menus, taught piano so they could entertain guests, taught to dance and dress and manage servants. But Edith was actually educated, truly educated. She spoke French fluently, not just parlor French. She could read French literature and discuss it intelligently. She was interested in art and history and literature. She read voraciously. She had opinions, strong opinions, about books, about politics, about how society should work. She was, in many fundamental ways, George's intellectual equal, which was probably why he fell in love with her, why he felt he could actually share his life with her. The wedding took place in Paris in June of 1898, a small ceremony, just family and close friends, no enormous society wedding, no newspapers, no publicity, exactly how George wanted it. They honeymooned in Europe for several months, traveling to the places George loved, the Loire Valley, the great estates of England, Italian villas, German castles. But this time, he wasn't traveling alone. He was traveling with someone who understood what he was seeing, who appreciated the architecture and gardens, who could discuss the history and design principles, who shared his passion for beauty and learning. And when they returned to Biltmore in late 1898, when Edith Vanderbilt walked into that enormous château for the first time as its mistress, she transformed it. Transformed it from George's private refuge into something more. Into a home. A real home. She began hosting gatherings, but not the kind of gatherings that other Vanderbilts hosted. Not costume balls with thousands of guests. Not yacht races or horse races or gambling parties. She hosted salons, intellectual gatherings, small groups of interesting people coming together to discuss ideas. Writers, artists, musicians, scientists, historians, philosophers, people who had something to say, something to contribute beyond gossip and small talk. The guest book from those years, which still exists in the Biltmore archives, reads like a who's who of turn-of-the-century American culture. Edith Wharton visited multiple times. The novelist, one of the greatest American writers of the era. She and Edith Vanderbilt became close friends, corresponded regularly. Wharton would later write about estates like Biltmore in her novels, the tension between old money and new money, between European sophistication and American ambition. Henry James came and was, according to his letters to friends, both deeply impressed and slightly intimidated by the scale of Biltmore. He'd seen great houses in England and Europe, but nothing in America compared to this. He wrote that it felt like walking through a French château that had somehow been transported whole to the American wilderness. Theodore Roosevelt visited in 1901. He'd just become president after McKinley's assassination. Young, energetic, passionate about conservation. He and George spent hours discussing forestry policy, walking through the scientifically managed forests, examining Pinchot's work, discussing how these principles could be applied at national scale. Roosevelt was deeply influenced by what he saw at Biltmore. The scientific forestry program that George and Pinchot had established became a model. When Roosevelt later created the National Forest Service, when he set aside millions of acres of federal land for conservation, he was directly influenced by what he'd learned at Biltmore. George Vanderbilt's private estate had national policy implications. But here's what most people don't realize about Biltmore in those early years. What doesn't make it into the tourist brochures or history books. It wasn't just entertaining the wealthy and powerful. The estate was functioning exactly as George had envisioned it, exactly as he'd planned. The forests were producing timber, real commercial timber operations, trees being harvested selectively based on Pinchot's management plans. And the forests weren't being depleted, weren't being damaged. They were actually improving, getting healthier, more diverse, more sustainable. This was proof of concept, proof that scientific forestry actually worked. The timber operations were generating revenue, not huge amounts, not enough to offset the house's operating costs, but real money, proving that sustainable forestry could be profitable. The dairy was thriving, Jersey cows producing rich, high-quality milk, butter that won prizes at agricultural fairs, cheese that was sold in Asheville and beyond. The Biltmore dairy became known for quality, became a brand. People sought out Biltmore dairy products because they were demonstrably better than mass-produced alternatives. The farms were demonstrating modern agricultural techniques, crop rotation, scientific fertilization using newly understood principles of soil chemistry, irrigation systems. Local farmers would visit, would see what was possible, would learn techniques they could apply on their own land. George wasn't just running farms for his own use. He was teaching, demonstrating, sharing knowledge, and the impact on the local economy was substantial. Biltmore employed hundreds of people directly. Hundreds more worked in supporting businesses, suppliers, contractors. The estate was one of the largest employers in western North Carolina, and George treated workers better than virtually any employer of the era. Higher wages, better conditions, health care, education for workers' children. In 1900, George and Edith had a daughter. They named her Cornelia, and suddenly, Biltmore had an heir, a future, a next generation. Cornelia Vanderbilt grew up in that château. Think about what that childhood must have been like. She had her own pony, a beautiful, well-trained pony that she learned to ride almost as soon as she could walk. She would ride through thousands of acres of forest with her father, exploring trails, seeing the estate that would one day be hers. She played in Olmsted's gardens, hide and seek among the boxwoods of the walled garden, climbing trees, running through the azalea garden when it bloomed. She was educated by private tutors, not just any tutors, the best that money could hire, specialists in different subjects. She learned French, German, Latin, mathematics from a Cambridge-educated mathematician, science from a professor hired away from a university, history from a published historian, all in that magnificent library with 20,000 books at her disposal. She grew up surrounded by art and beauty and intellectual conversation, guest lists that included presidents and novelists and scientists. She heard dinner-table conversations about forestry policy and literature and art and philosophy. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary childhood, privileged beyond measure, but also, in its way, isolated. She had everything except other children, except normal childhood experiences, except any sense of what life was like for ordinary people. George was building something that would last. That's what he believed. A family seat, a dynasty home, a place that would be passed down through generations. His brother's mansions in New York were showpieces, empty displays of wealth. But Biltmore was meant to be lived in, loved, inhabited by Vanderbilts for centuries. He was creating a legacy that would outlast all of them. And for over a decade, from 1895 to about 1910, it seemed to be working. The house was functioning. The estate was producing. The community was benefiting. Cornelia was growing up. Everything seemed sustainable. Everything seemed permanent. But there was a problem that George tried very hard to ignore, tried to pretend didn't exist, tried to solve through various schemes and strategies. The operating costs were crushing, absolutely crushing. Running Biltmore cost over $250,000 per year, every single year. In early 1900s money, that's equivalent to something like $7 or $8 million annually in today's terms, just to keep the place running. 80 to 100 servants on salary year-round. Maintenance on a house the size of a palace. Every roof leak costs thousands to fix. Every cracked window, and there were hundreds of windows, requires specialist craftsmen to replace. Property taxes that kept increasing as local governments realized just how valuable this property was. Utilities. Even generating your own electricity costs money. Coal for the boilers, maintenance on the hydroelectric system, supplies, food for 100 people, clothes, linens, everything. The estate's income from timber operations, dairy sales, and farm products covered maybe a third of those costs. Maybe, on a good year. The rest had to come from George's personal fortune, from his trust fund income. And slowly, gradually, year by year, that trust fund was shrinking. George tried various schemes to make the estate more profitable. He expanded the commercial dairy operations, built a creamery, increased butter and cheese production. He sold more timber, pushed Pinchot to increase sustainable harvest rates, He experimented with different agricultural approaches on the farmland, tried growing different crops, tried different livestock. Nothing generated enough revenue. Nothing came close. The problem was fundamental. The house was simply too large, too expensive, too much. A 50-room mansion would have been expensive to maintain. A 100-room mansion would have been borderline impossible. A 250-room mansion was financial suicide. But George couldn't bring himself to make hard choices. This was his life's work, his masterpiece, his legacy for Cornelia. He couldn't shut down sections of the house, couldn't lay off half the staff, couldn't admit, even to himself, that he'd built something unsustainable. So he kept going, kept spending down his capital, kept hoping something would change, kept believing he could make it work. And then, in March of 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt traveled to Washington, D.C. on what should have been a routine trip. He was there on business related to his forestry operations, meetings with government officials about conservation policy, discussions about potentially expanding scientific forestry to federal lands. Nothing dangerous, nothing unusual. While in Washington, George developed abdominal pain, sharp, intense pain in his lower right abdomen, appendicitis. His appendix was inflamed, infected, at risk of rupturing. In 1914, this was serious but treatable. Surgery was routine, risky, but routine. George checked into a hospital, underwent emergency surgery. The surgery went well. The surgeon removed the infected appendix successfully. George seemed to be recovering, seemed to be doing fine. And then, 3 days after surgery, complications developed. The kind of complications that modern antibiotics would prevent easily. But antibiotics wouldn't be discovered for another 15 years. Infection set in. Sepsis, his body's overwhelming response to infection. Fever, delirium, organ failure spreading through his system. Despite the best medical care available in 1914, despite everything doctors tried, George's condition deteriorated rapidly. And on March 6, 1914, 9 days after developing appendicitis, George Washington Vanderbilt II died. He was 51 years old. He had owned Biltmore for 25 years, had lived there for 19, had poured his heart and soul and fortune into creating something beautiful and meaningful. And now he was gone. The funeral was held at All Souls Church, the church he'd built, the church where he'd worshipped every Sunday with Edith. The pews were packed, overflowing, standing room only. But here's what's remarkable about who was there, who came to mourn him. Yes, there were wealthy friends from New York, family members, social connections. But the church was filled with workers from the estate, farmers from the surrounding area, shopkeepers from Asheville, regular people, working people, people who'd never met most of the other Vanderbilts, people who wouldn't be caught dead at a society funeral. But they came for George, because he'd been different, because he'd treated them with dignity and respect, because he'd paid fair wages and provided good jobs and built schools and hospitals, because he'd actually cared about the community. He was buried in the family mausoleum on the estate, a small, elegant stone building, not ostentatious, not showy, just dignified. And Edith Vanderbilt, 41 years old, was left with a 13-year-old daughter, a 250-room château, and a financial disaster. Because while George had been worth approximately $50 million when he died, about $1.5 billion in today's money, most of that wealth was tied up, locked away, illiquid. It was in land. 125,000 acres of North Carolina mountains. Valuable, but you can't spend land. It was in the house itself, in furniture and art and books, in collections worth millions, but hard to sell quickly. The liquid assets, the actual available cash, was far less than anyone expected. George had been spending down his capital for years. The estate's operating costs had consumed millions, and the income from George's trust funds stopped the moment he died. Suddenly, immediately, that revenue stream ended, and the operating costs of Biltmore continued. $250,000 per year, every year, forever. The estate's timber and dairy income couldn't cover it, not even close. Edith faced a choice that would determine everything. She could sell. That was the practical option, the smart financial decision. Break up the estate, auction off the art and books. Those alone would fetch millions. Put the furniture up for sale. Subdivide the land. Developers would pay good money for parcels near Asheville. Demolish the house. The limestone could be salvaged and sold. The land the house sat on was valuable. This option would generate tens of millions of dollars, enough to secure Cornelia's future, enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. That's what any financial advisor would have recommended. That's what made sense. Or Edith could fight to keep George's vision alive, to preserve what he'd built, to maintain the estate for Cornelia, to honor the legacy George had wanted to create. This option was financially insane. It would consume whatever liquid assets remained. It would require constant struggle to keep the place operating. It might ultimately fail, anyway. Edith chose to fight. She chose loyalty to George's memory over financial prudence, and she had no idea how hard the fight was about to become, because the world was about to make that fight exponentially harder. 3 months after George died, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo. Within weeks, World War I began in Europe. The global economy convulsed. America wouldn't enter the war until 1917, but the effects were immediate. Resources shifted to war production. Luxury goods became suspect. Society balls and elaborate parties stopped. Being visibly, ostentatiously wealthy started to feel unpatriotic, started to attract criticism and resentment. The newspapers that had once breathlessly covered society events now ran stories about war casualties and food shortages and sacrifice. The Vanderbilt name, which had once represented glamour and success, now represented excess, indulgence, while boys died in trenches. And there was something else. Something that had happened the year before George died. Something that Edith was about to discover would change everything. In 1913, just 1 year before George's death, the United States government had ratified the 16th Amendment to the Constitution, the Income Tax Amendment. For the first time in American history, Congress had permanent, explicit authority to levy taxes on income from whatever source derived. The era of untaxed fortunes was over. Forever. Let me explain what this meant. What it really meant for families like the Vanderbilts. Before 1913, the federal government had imposed income tax only once in American history, during the Civil War, a temporary measure to fund the Union war effort. That tax expired in 1872. The Supreme Court later struck down another income tax attempt in 1895, ruling that direct taxation without apportionment among the states violated the Constitution. For the entire Gilded Age, from the 1870s through the early 1900s, wealthy Americans faced no federal income tax whatsoever. Zero? None. They could accumulate enormous fortunes, spend money however they wanted, build massive mansions. There was no government taking a percentage, no obligation to share wealth. The only federal taxes were tariffs on imported goods and excise taxes on specific products like tobacco and alcohol. That was it. A man like William Henry Vanderbilt earning $10 million per year in the 1880s, paid exactly 0 federal income tax. He kept all of it. Every penny. The 16th Amendment changed that completely. Congress passed the first permanent income tax law in October 1913. The initial rates looked, on paper, quite modest, almost reasonable. Income below $3,000 faced no tax at all. Most Americans earned less than that, so most Americans paid nothing. Income between $3,000 and $20,000 was taxed at 1%. Just 1%. Barely noticeable. The top rate of 7% applied only to income exceeding $500,000 annually. In 1913, maybe a few hundred families in the entire country had that much income. So the tax appeared to target only the absolute wealthiest, and even for them, 7% seemed manageable, hardly confiscatory. But the rates didn't stay modest for long. World War I changed everything. The war demanded unprecedented government revenue. Armies had to be equipped. Soldiers had to be paid. Weapons had to be manufactured. Ships had to be built. All of it required money on a scale the federal government had never spent before. Congress raised the top marginal rate to 15% in 1916, just 3 years after the income tax began. Then to 67% in 1917. Then to 77% in 1918. In just 5 years, the top rate went from 7% to 77%. An 11-fold increase. A man who earned $2 million in 1918 would surrender more than $1.5 million to federal taxation, would keep less than $500,000. The government was taking more than 3/4 of high incomes. This was revolutionary, unprecedented, and it was popular. The American public, watching their sons die in European trenches, watching families make enormous sacrifices for the war effort, had no sympathy for millionaires complaining about taxes. The war ended in November 1918, and many wealthy Americans assumed, hoped, believed that the high tax rates would end too. That taxes would return to something approaching the pre-war norm. That this was temporary. They were wrong. Congress did reduce rates somewhat in the early 1920s. The top rate dropped to 73% in 1921, then to 58% in 1922, then to 46% in 1924, finally to 25% in 1925. For a few years in the mid-1920s, it looked like taxation might return to manageable levels. Wealthy families resumed building mansions, throwing parties, living openly luxuriously again. The stock market boomed. Fortunes were being made in speculation. Everything seemed fine, seemed sustainable, seemed like the Gilded Age might return. Then came October 1929. The stock market crashed. Not a correction, not a normal downturn, a total collapse. Stock prices fell by 90% over 3 years. 90%. Fortunes disappeared overnight. Banks failed by the thousands. Literally thousands of banks. People's savings vanished. Businesses collapsed. Unemployment reached 25% nationally. In industrial cities, in some areas, unemployment exceeded 30%. 1 in 3 workers couldn't find jobs, couldn't feed their families. The Great Depression had begun, and it would last for over a decade. The worst economic catastrophe in American history, and the public fury at the wealthy intensified to levels not seen since the 1890s, to levels that maybe exceeded even the Gilded Age anger. Because now, people weren't just poor. They were desperate, starving, living in shanty towns called Hoovervilles, named mockingly after President Hoover, waiting in bread lines, selling apples on street corners. And they could see that wealthy families still had money. still lived in mansions, still had plenty. The contrast was obscene, offensive, rage-inducing. President Herbert Hoover, himself a wealthy man who'd made a fortune in mining before entering politics, proposed raising taxes on the rich to address the massive budget deficit and fund relief programs. Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1932. The top marginal rate jumped to 63%. Then, Franklin Roosevelt won the presidency in a landslide in November 1932. Won by enormous margins. The public gave him a mandate for change, for action, for attacking the wealthy and redistributing their fortunes. And Roosevelt came after the wealthy with a vengeance, with ideological conviction, with political calculation, with genuine belief that concentrated wealth threatened democracy. The Revenue Act of 1935 raised the top rate to 79% on income exceeding $5 million annually. Roosevelt explicitly called it the wealth tax, defended it publicly as an attack on concentrated fortunes. He gave speeches arguing that extreme inequality threatened the American system itself, that democracy couldn't survive if a tiny elite controlled most of the wealth. That progressive taxation would redistribute resources more fairly across society, make America more equal, more just, more democratic. The Supreme Court, which had once struck down income taxes as unconstitutional, now upheld these new rates. The court's composition had changed. Its thinking had evolved. The justices recognized that the country had moved on, that the old constitutional objections no longer held political or legal weight. By 1940, the top marginal rate had reached 81%. During World War II, it climbed even higher, to 94% on income over $200,000. 94%. The government was taking nearly everything above that threshold. For the next 3 decades, from the 1940s through the 1970s, the top rate never dropped below 70%. An entire generation of Americans grew up in a country where the highest earners paid the vast majority of their income in federal taxes. A wealthy American who earned $1 million annually in the 1950s might keep less than $100,000 after federal taxes. The government took $900,000. This was the new normal, the new reality, and there was no going back. But income tax was only part of the squeeze on mansion economics, only one leg of a 3-legged system designed to prevent the concentration of multi-generational wealth. Estate taxes struck when wealth transferred between generations, and they hit hard. Congress first imposed a federal estate tax in 1916 at a maximum rate of 10% on estates exceeding $5 million. Like the income tax, it started modest. But it didn't stay modest. The rate rose steadily. 25% by 1924, 45% by 1934, 77% by 1941. By the 1940s, if you died with a large estate, the government took most of it before it could pass to your heirs. The combination of income tax and estate tax was devastating for wealthy families. Absolutely devastating. Think about what it meant. During your lifetime, income tax took 70 to 90% of your high earnings. You couldn't accumulate wealth the way Cornelius Vanderbilt had. You couldn't build a fortune by keeping everything you earned. The government took most of it every year. Then, when you died, estate tax took another 70% or more of whatever wealth you'd managed to accumulate. Your heirs didn't inherit the full estate. They inherited a fraction, maybe 30%, maybe less. And if those heirs tried to maintain a family mansion, annual property taxes consumed additional wealth every single year. The 3-part tax system, income tax plus estate tax plus property tax, ensured that even the largest fortunes would be dispersed within a few generations. mathematically ensured it. There was no way to preserve Gilded Age-level wealth across generations while paying these taxes. It was impossible. And property taxes were escalating at state and local levels simultaneously. Municipalities desperate for revenue during the Depression raised property assessments, increased mill rates. A mansion that might have faced property taxes of a few $1,000s annually in 1913 could face bills exceeding $50,000, $100,000 by the 1930s. And those bills came every year, every single year, whether you had income or not, whether your investments were profitable or not, whether you could afford it or not, pay or lose the property. Edith Vanderbilt watched all of this happening, watched the tax system tighten around wealthy families like a noose, and she understood what it meant for Biltmore, understood with perfect clarity that the world had changed, that the era that made Biltmore possible was over. The house required $250,000 per year to operate. George's estate was tied up in probate for years. His trust fund income had stopped. The forests and dairy weren't generating nearly enough revenue. And now, taxes were coming. Income taxes on whatever revenue the estate managed to produce. Property taxes on the land and house and buildings. Eventually, estate taxes when the property passed to Cornelia. The mathematics were simple and absolutely brutal. There was no sustainable way forward, no realistic path to keeping Biltmore as a private residence. Edith started making cuts, deep cuts. She reduced staff from 80 people to 60, then to 40, then to 20. Each round of layoffs hurt. These were people who'd worked for George, who'd known him, who'd been loyal to the family. She closed entire sections of the house to save on heating costs. The guest bedrooms on the third floor, unused for years anyway. Closed. The bowling alley in the basement. Closed. The gymnasium. Closed. Even some second-floor bedrooms. She and Cornelia and the remaining staff occupied maybe 30 rooms total. The other 220 rooms stood empty, furniture covered with sheets. Dust accumulating. She sold some of George's art collection, pieces that weren't his favorites, landscapes, minor works by second-tier artists. She sold them through galleries in New York, got decent prices. The money helped, but it wasn't enough. It was never enough. During World War I, Edith tried to do her part, tried to support the war effort while maybe generating positive publicity that would help protect the estate. She opened parts of Biltmore to war-related activities. The sheep that George had kept primarily for aesthetic reasons, for the beauty of seeing them graze in pastoral settings, suddenly had a purpose. Their wool went to military uniforms. The farms increased production, sent food to support the troops. The dairy expanded operations. Butter and cheese for military use. Edith made it clear that Biltmore was contributing, was doing its part. But the financial bleeding continued. Year after year after year, expenses exceeded income. The gap was maybe $100,000 per year, maybe more. Doesn't sound like much compared to $250,000 total operating costs. But $100,000 per year, year after year, adds up, accumulates, drains the remaining capital. By the early 1920s, Edith was genuinely desperate. The liquid assets from George's estate were running out. The trust funds were depleted. The timber and dairy income covered maybe half the operating costs now with reduced staff and closed sections. But that still left a massive shortfall. And Edith couldn't sell, couldn't bring herself to sell. This was George's legacy, Cornelia's inheritance, the life's work of the man she'd loved. How could she sell it? How could she give up? She held on, kept cutting expenses, kept hoping something would change. And then, in 1924, her daughter made a decision that would at least temporarily delay the disaster. Cornelia Vanderbilt got married. His name was John Francis Amherst Cecil. He was British, English, from an aristocratic family. Not top-tier nobility, but genuine aristocracy. The younger son of a lord, educated at Eton and Oxford, the kind of education that money alone couldn't buy. That required breeding, family connections. He was charming, cultured, well-read, everything that Edith would have wanted for her daughter. And most importantly, crucially, John Cecil understood estate management. This was something Americans, even wealthy Americans, generally didn't understand. But British aristocrats had been managing large estates for centuries, often at losses, often spending family fortunes to maintain estates that never generated profit. They did it because estates were the family identity, the family seat, something you preserved regardless of cost. British aristocracy had developed sophisticated strategies for estate management, how to maximize agricultural revenue, how to manage forests sustainably, how to reduce operating costs without destroying the estate's character, how to think in terms of generations rather than years. John Cecil came to Biltmore in the early 1920s, met Cornelia. They courted, fell in love. And in April 1924, they were married at Biltmore. The wedding was the social event of the decade in the South, hundreds of guests, the kind of event that Biltmore hadn't hosted since George was alive. Newspapers covered it extensively. The marriage of the Biltmore heiress. All Souls Church was packed, the reception in the house, music and dancing and celebration. For one day, Biltmore felt like it had in the golden years, alive, vibrant, full of purpose. John Cecil moved into Biltmore, and he looked at the estate with fresh eyes, with the analytical perspective of someone trained in estate management, and he saw immediately what Edith couldn't quite admit to herself. The house, as currently configured, was doomed. The financial model was unsustainable. The operating costs would eventually consume everything. The estate would be lost. The only question was whether it would be lost through slow decline or through deliberate action. But John also saw potential, saw possibilities that Edith, trapped in grief and loyalty to George's memory, hadn't considered. He convinced Edith and Cornelia to make radical changes. Changes that George probably wouldn't have approved. Changes that felt like betrayal of his vision. But changes that might, just might, save the estate. First, they had to sell land. Massive amounts of land. George had purchased 125,000 acres, intending to keep it all forever. To manage it all as an integrated estate. But that was impossible now. They needed to shed most of it, needed liquid capital, needed to reduce the property tax burden. But not to developers. That would destroy George's conservation legacy. That would turn the forests into subdivisions and strip malls and parking lots. Everything George hated. Instead, John Cecil negotiated with the federal government, the United States Forest Service. In 1914, Congress had passed a law allowing the federal government to purchase land for national forests, to preserve forests for public use. The Forest Service was interested in the Biltmore forests. Gifford Pinchot's scientific forestry program had made them famous. They were the best-managed private forests in America, a model for what federal forest management could become. John Cecil negotiated a deal. Biltmore would sell 87,000 acres to the United States Forest Service, nearly 70% of the original estate. It would become Pisgah National Forest, named after the biblical mountain. Protected forever. Never developed. Never logged destructively. Managed for public benefit in perpetuity. George's conservation legacy would be preserved, just under federal control instead of family control. The price was terrible. Genuinely terrible. About $5 per acre. less than 75 cents per acre in some parcels. Far, far below market value. If they'd sold to developers, they might have gotten $50 per acre or more. But John Cecil knew they had no choice. Selling to the government was the only option that preserved George's vision while generating necessary capital. The sale went through in multiple tranches over the late 1920s. The money that came in, several $1 million total, went immediately into maintaining the estate, paying down debts, covering operating costs, stabilizing the finances, temporarily. Still, even with the land sale, even with the estate now reduced to 38,000 acres, Biltmore was struggling. The remaining land still required enormous upkeep. The house was still deteriorating despite reduced staff and closed sections. Roofs leaked, plaster cracked, wood rotted, stone weathered. You can't simply stop maintaining a structure this size. You can defer maintenance for a while. But eventually, deferred maintenance becomes critical damage, and critical damage becomes structural failure. The costs of keeping even a partially maintained mansion were crushing. And then came October 1929. The stock market crashed, and everything got worse. Much, much worse. Let me show you what happened to the money, to the Vanderbilt fortune, because this is crucial for understanding why Biltmore is the only mansion left standing. Cornelius Vanderbilt died in 1877, worth $105 million. William Henry doubled it to $200 million by 1885. By the early 1900s, if you added up all the various branches of the Vanderbilt family, all the descendants of the Commodore, they collectively controlled an estimated $500 million, $500 million, in early 1900s money. Roughly $15 billion in today's currency. This was family dynasty wealth, multi-generational fortune, the kind of money that should last forever. By 1930, most of it was gone, vanished, evaporated. How? Multiple factors combined to destroy the fortune. The railroad companies that generated Vanderbilt wealth were struggling. Competition from automobiles and trucks was cutting into railroad profits. Henry Ford's Model T, introduced in 1908, had made cars affordable for ordinary Americans. Trucks were taking freight business from railroads, and the Vanderbilt descendants managing the family railroads weren't ruthless competitors like Cornelius. They were inherited wealth, trust fund executives. They weren't innovating, weren't adapting, weren't fighting. The companies stagnated, profits declined, stock values dropped. Then there were bad investments. Vanderbilt descendants putting money into continue Caro 18, 13 schemes and ventures that failed, real estate speculation that went wrong, business investments that collapsed. The family's financial advisors weren't the geniuses that Cornelius had been. They made mistakes, lost money. The stock market crash of 1929 wiped out millions more. Vanderbilt money was invested in stocks like everyone else's. When the market collapsed, when stock values dropped 90%, the Vanderbilt portfolio collapsed too. Millions disappeared overnight. And the tax system was consuming everything else. Every time someone died, estate taxes took 70% or more. The fortune was divided among more heirs each generation. Cornelius to William was one person. William to his 8 children was 8 ways. Those 8 had multiple children each. By the 3rd generation, there were dozens of Vanderbilt descendants, and the fortune was being split dozens of ways, each piece smaller than the last, each piece subject to estate taxes, each piece being spent on mansions and yachts and parties. The mansions themselves became impossible to maintain, and one by one, with heartbreaking regularity, they were demolished. The destruction began on Fifth Avenue in New York. In 1926, just 51 years after it was built, The Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion at 5th Avenue and 57th Street came down. 130 rooms, a ballroom that held 1,200 guests, a house that had cost $3 million to build. The family had lived there for 43 years. Demolition took 6 months. Wrecking crews tearing down Indiana limestone, smashing carved woodwork, destroying craftsmanship that couldn't be replicated. The site became a commercial building. A bank occupied the ground floor, offices above. The land was worth more empty than occupied. The Vanderbilts had made the economically rational choice, but something was lost that could never be recovered. The pattern repeated across Manhattan with sickening regularity. William K. Vanderbilt's mansion at 665th Avenue, completed in 1883. The first French Renaissance château in New York. The house that set the style that dominated Gilded Age architecture. Demolished in 1927. Gone in 6 months. Mrs. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor's mansion at 5th Avenue and 65th Street. The house where the 400 gathered, where New York society was defined. Demolished in 1926. Replaced with a luxury apartment building. The statistics are staggering. In 1900, more than 100 major Gilded Age mansions lined 5th Avenue between 42nd Street and 96th Street. Palaces, each one representing millions of dollars in construction costs, hundreds of thousands in annual maintenance, each one designed to last centuries. By 1950, fewer than 10 survived. The rest were demolished and replaced with apartment buildings, office towers, hotels, and commercial structures. The mansion die-off spread beyond Manhattan. Newport, Rhode Island, had been the summer capital of Gilded Age society. Families built cottages, they called them cottages, along the Atlantic coast. Marble House, the Breakers, Rosecliff, Château-sur-Mer, houses that rivaled European palaces in scale and cost. These were vacation homes, used 8 weeks per year, staffed year-round by dozens of servants to keep them ready. The Breakers, built by Cornelius Vanderbilt II in 1895 at a cost of $7 million, survived only because the family donated it to the Preservation Society of Newport County in 1948. The alternative was demolition. No family member could afford to maintain a 70-room summer house that required 40 servants to operate. Donating it as a museum provided a tax deduction while ensuring its preservation. The house opened to tourists in 1948. Admission fees now fund its maintenance. Marble House, built by William K. Vanderbilt in 1892 for $11 million, followed the same path. Donated to the Preservation Society in 1963, became a museum. Rosecliff, Château-sur-Mer, the Elms, other Newport cottages survived through similar arrangements. Houses that couldn't attract donors or preservation societies disappeared, were demolished, erased. Chicago lost virtually its entire collection of Gilded Age mansions. The Potter-Palmer Castle on Lakeshore Drive, completed in 1885, 42 rooms, a 3-story art gallery. Palmer had been one of Chicago's wealthiest merchants. His mansion defined elite architecture in the city, demolished in 1950. The land was worth more empty. The same story repeated in Philadelphia, Cleveland, San Francisco, every major American city. Houses built to last centuries were demolished within 2 or 3 generations. The economics were inescapable, absolutely inescapable. Annual operating costs exceeded what even wealthy families could justify spending. Property taxes consumed additional resources every year. The land itself was worth far more for higher density development, for uses that actually generated income. What replaced these mansions reveals the transformation clearly. Apartment buildings generated rental income from dozens or hundreds of units on the same land that had held one family. Office buildings created even higher returns. Commercial hotels put property to profit-generating use. The American real estate market had become too sophisticated, too efficient, too expensive to tolerate single-family mansions on premium urban land. Even if wealthy families could afford the operating costs, which most couldn't, the opportunity cost was enormous. The land was simply too valuable to use for a private residence. The few mansions that survived did so by transforming their function entirely, by becoming something other than residences. The Frick Collection in Manhattan occupies the former residence of industrialist Henry Clay Frick, completed in 1914. Frick designed it from the beginning, with eventual museum use in mind. His will provided an endowment to maintain it as a public art gallery after his death. The house opened as a museum in 1935. It was preserved by ceasing to be a home. The Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum occupies Andrew Carnegie's mansion at 5th Avenue and 91st Street, built in 1902. 64 rooms. Carnegie chose the location specifically because land was cheaper than further downtown. The family donated it to the Smithsonian in 1972 for conversion to a museum, preserved through institutional use. The Morgan Library preserves J.P. Morgan's library building adjacent to his demolished mansion. Morgan built the library in 1906 to house his collection of rare books and manuscripts. The mansion is gone, but the library survives as a museum and research center. The pattern holds absolutely. Institutional use justified preservation. Residential use guaranteed demolition. Even Biltmore, the largest and most famous of all American mansions, survived only by opening to tourists in 1930. The Vanderbilt family retained ownership, but they could no longer afford to live in the entire house. Admission fees from visitors covered operating costs that no family could sustain privately. The house became a museum that happened to have family members still living in one small section. Not a family home that welcomed occasional visitors. The staff crisis accelerated the demolition wave, made it faster, more complete. Domestic service, the industry that employed millions of Americans before World War I, collapsed in the 1920s and 30s. Young people chose factory jobs over household service. Factory work paid better, had defined hours, didn't require living with employers, didn't involve the subservience and loss of privacy that domestic service demanded. Social attitudes shifted against service as a career. It became seen as degrading, backward, something for people who couldn't do anything else. Even families with sufficient wealth to maintain large staffs found it increasingly difficult to hire qualified workers. Nobody wanted to be a servant anymore. Technology helped, but couldn't compensate entirely. Modern appliances reduced the work required for cleaning and cooking. Central heating systems eliminated the need for servants to tend coal furnaces in every room. Electric refrigeration eliminated ice delivery. Vacuum cleaners reduced the number of maids needed for cleaning. But no technology could change the fundamental problem. A 100-room house remained vastly more expensive to operate than a 20-room house, regardless of mechanical improvements. The scale itself was the problem. The Great Depression provided the final push toward demolition. Families struggling to maintain enormous houses while their investment income disappeared faced stark choices. Some held on through the 1930s, consuming capital, bleeding money every year, hoping the economy would recover, hoping their fortunes would rebound. Most concluded that preserving the family fortune mattered more than preserving the family mansion. The houses came down. By 1950, the transformation was complete. The American mansion as Gilded Age symbol had become extinct. Those few that survived did so as museums, schools, or institutional buildings. None functioned as private residences in the way their builders had intended. The era of building palaces for oneself had ended permanently. and it would never return. But here's the thing that's absolutely crucial to understand. The billionaires didn't disappear. The wealthy didn't vanish. They didn't lose their power. They didn't become less influential. If anything, they became more powerful, more influential, more dominant. The wealth is greater now than in the Gilded Age. The concentration is worse. The control is more absolute. But it's invisible, hidden, sophisticated. Let me show you what I mean. Bill Gates lives in a house on Lake Washington near Seattle. The residence is called Xanadu 2.0, named after the fictional mansion in Citizen Kane. It measures approximately 66,000 square feet, spread across multiple buildings on 5 acres of waterfront property. This is large by any standard. But it's 1/3 the size of Biltmore. 1/3. And Bill Gates, at his peak, was worth over $100 billion. He could have built 10 Biltmores. 20. He could have built a palace that would make Versailles look modest. He chose not to. Why? 3 reasons. First, security. A visible palace advertises exactly where you live, makes you a target for criminals, kidnappers, activists, terrorists, crazy people. In the modern world, being publicly identifiable as ultra-wealthy is dangerous. Cornelius Vanderbilt could build mansions because the world was different. Security threats were different. Modern billionaires face risks that didn't exist in the Gilded Age, so they hide, build behind walls and trees, use corporate entities to obscure ownership. Second, taxation. Property assessors notice palaces. A 250-room mansion generates an enormous property tax bill, annual taxes that could run into the millions every single year, forever. Modern billionaires minimize property tax exposure by building smaller, spreading holdings across multiple properties, locating in favorable tax jurisdictions. Third, public relations. Building a palace invites media coverage, criticism, political attacks. The Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011 demonstrated continuing public hostility toward visible wealth inequality. Politicians seeking populist support target billionaire excess regularly. Conspicuous consumption creates political liabilities that smart billionaires avoid. So Gates built something comfortable, luxurious, but deliberately modest in appearance. 66,000 square feet hidden behind trees, high-tech, private, but not palace, not something that screams wealth. Jeff Bezos follows the same pattern. His real estate holdings span multiple properties worth hundreds of millions collectively. A mansion in Beverly Hills purchased for $165 million, apartments in New York, a ranch in Texas, a compound in Washington, D.C. Each property is substantial, expensive, luxurious, but none approaches palace scale. And here's what's crucial. They're hidden, owned through LLCs and trusts that obscure personal connection. Public records show corporate entities, not Jeff Bezos personally. You can't find his houses on Google Maps, can't stand outside and photograph them, can't organize protests at his gates. The wealth is invisible by design. Mark Zuckerberg bought his Palo Alto home in 2011 for $7 million. The house itself is relatively modest, about 5,000 square feet. But then Zuckerberg did something revealing. He purchased the 4 surrounding properties over the following years for a combined $43 million, not to expand his house, to create a buffer zone, to control who could observe his residence. The investment was defensive, strategic, $50 million spent on privacy. Larry Ellison took the strategy to its logical extreme. In 2012, Ellison purchased approximately 98% of the Hawaiian island of Lanai for $300 million. He didn't buy land for a mansion. He bought an island, the entire island, 140 square miles, population about 3,000 people. Ellison controls virtually everything. Who comes? Who goes? What gets developed? It's the ultimate privacy, the ultimate security. And he didn't build a mega mansion. He developed multiple properties across the island. Resorts, agricultural operations. The island itself is the estate. Geographic isolation provides security that walls alone cannot. Ted Turner owns approximately 2 million acres across multiple ranches in Montana, Nebraska, New Mexico, and other western states. 2 million acres. That's over 3,000 square miles, larger than the state of Delaware. Turner is the second largest private landowner in America. John Malone owns 2.2 million acres, the largest. But these aren't residential showpieces. These are working ranches, cattle operations, bison herds. The residences on these properties are relatively modest. The power lies in controlling vast territories, controlling land on a scale that rivals small countries, and doing it quietly, without publicity, without attracting attention. The modern billionaire strategy is clear. Don't build palaces. Build compounds. Build portfolios. Spread holdings across multiple properties. Use corporate structures to obscure ownership. Prioritize privacy over display. But it goes far deeper than real estate. Modern billionaires have learned to deploy wealth in ways that generate power while remaining invisible. Ways that make Gilded Age robber barons look like amateurs. Let me show you the foundations. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation holds an endowment exceeding $50 billion. $50 billion. Annual grant-making exceeds $5 billion per year. $5 billion per year being distributed to causes the Gates Foundation chooses. The foundation shapes global health policy. It funds vaccination programs in dozens of countries. It influences education reform across the United States. It directs agricultural development in Africa. Gates Foundation funding decisions determine research priorities in universities worldwide. Determine which health interventions get scaled up. Determine which educational approaches get tested. This is power that persists regardless of where Bill Gates sleeps at night. Power that extends across continents. Power that shapes the lives of hundreds of millions of people. A mansion displays wealth. A foundation with a $50 billion endowment shapes the priorities of governments, universities, and international organizations. And critically, it's tax deductible. Gates gets a tax deduction for every dollar he puts into the foundation. Then the foundation pays no taxes on investment income. Then grants from the foundation provide public benefit while advancing Gates's priorities. It's legal. It's encouraged by the tax code. And it provides far more power than any palace. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative takes it further. Established in 2015, Mark Zuckerberg structured his philanthropy as an LLC, not a traditional foundation. This provides even greater flexibility. An LLC can make political donations, can invest in for-profit companies, can lobby for policy changes, can do things traditional foundations cannot. Zuckerberg pledged to transfer 99% of his Facebook shares to the initiative, a commitment worth over $100 billion at peak valuations. But it's an LLC. It faces no requirements to distribute funds annually, no restrictions on political activity, no obligation to disclose finances publicly beyond basic corporate reporting. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative operates as a private investment vehicle that can pursue any goal the founders choose, charitable or otherwise, while benefiting from tax deductions. Jeff Bezos announced the Bezos Earth Fund in 2020. $10 billion committed to fight climate change. The sum represents roughly 8% of his net worth at announcement. Substantial, but hardly a sacrifice. The fund provides Bezos with enormous influence over climate policy, over environmental organizations worldwide, and most importantly, it provides favorable publicity, positive press, at a time when Amazon faces increasing criticism for its environmental impact, for labor practices, for market dominance. $10 billion buys a lot of goodwill. Media ownership provides another channel for invisible power. Jeff Bezos purchased The Washington Post in 2013 for $250 million. Pocket change. Literal pocket change for a man worth over $100 billion. But the acquisition provided ownership of one of America's most influential newspapers, a publication read by every politician in Washington, a publication that shapes political discourse in the nation's capital, that influences elections, that can make or break political careers. Bezos acquired that power for less than the cost of maintaining Biltmore for 2 years. Laurene Powell Jobs, widow of Apple founder Steve Jobs, purchased a majority stake in The Atlantic magazine in 2017. The Atlantic reaches educated, influential readers, policymakers, opinion leaders. Mark Benioff, founder of Salesforce, bought Time magazine in 2018 for $190 million. Time's influence has declined from its mid-century peak, but it still reaches millions, still shapes narratives. Patrick Soon-Shiong purchased the Los Angeles Times in 2018 for $500 million. The largest newspaper on the West Coast. Billionaires acquiring major media properties for sums that represent tiny fractions of their total wealth. And the pattern reveals calculation. These properties don't make money. Most operate at losses or narrow margins. They're not good investments in financial terms. But for billionaires seeking platforms to shape public discourse, these properties are bargains. The cost is trivial. The potential influence is substantial. Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter in 2022 for approximately $44 billion represents the extreme version of this strategy. Twitter had roughly 400 million users. It served as a primary channel for political discourse, news dissemination, public debate. Musk's purchase gave him control over the algorithms that determine what hundreds of millions of people see, the moderation policies that govern what they can say, the features that shape how they interact, the ability to amplify or suppress any message, any user, any narrative. This is power on a scale that's hard to fully comprehend. John D. Rockefeller controlled 90% of American oil refining. That was economic power, market dominance. But his power operated through market mechanisms, through prices and supply. Musk controls Twitter. That's control over information flow itself, over public conversation, over how hundreds of millions of people communicate and receive news and form opinions. And here's what makes it truly powerful. Most people don't think about Twitter's ownership when they use it. Don't consider that one person controls what they see. Don't recognize it as concentrated power. The influence is invisible. Mark Zuckerberg's power is even more extensive. Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp. Combined user base exceeding 3 billion people. 3 billion. That's nearly half of humanity. Zuckerberg controls the algorithms that determine what content these billions of people see, controls the policies that govern what they can post, controls the data collection that monetizes their attention, controls the ad targeting that influences their behavior. This is power that no Gilded Age tycoon ever imagined. Cornelius Vanderbilt controlled railroads, physical infrastructure. Musk and Zuckerberg controlled digital infrastructure, the platforms through which modern life operates, through which people communicate, organize, do business, consume news, and they control it privately, with minimal oversight, with limited regulation. Jeff Bezos built Amazon into a platform controlling approximately 40% of American e-commerce. 40%. If you want to buy something online, you probably use Amazon. If you want to sell something online, you probably need Amazon. Bezos controls access to consumers, controls pricing through algorithms, controls logistics through fulfillment centers. Amazon Web Services provides the cloud infrastructure that runs huge portions of the internet. Websites, apps, services, all running on Amazon servers. Bezos controls the infrastructure of digital commerce and communication, and he owns the Washington Post. And he's building Blue Origin to commercialize space access. The integration of e-commerce platform, cloud computing infrastructure, media property, and aerospace company creates an empire that Standard Oil might envy. But you can't see it, can't photograph it, can't stand outside and protest it. The political influence flows naturally from economic control, inevitable. The largest corporations spend hundreds of millions of dollars annually on lobbying, on campaign contributions, on issue advocacy. The Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010 removed many restrictions on corporate political spending, opened channels for wealth to influence elections directly, openly, legally. Billionaires can now fund super PACs that spend unlimited amounts supporting or opposing candidates, can fund issue campaigns that shape public opinion, can hire armies of lobbyists who write actual legislation, who sit in congressional offices drafting bills, who attend committee meetings, who know more about policy details than elected representatives. The calculation is straightforward. Why build a palace that costs hundreds of millions, generates no income, exercises no power beyond aesthetic display, attracts media criticism and property taxes, when that same capital could fund a foundation that shapes global health policy for decades, could purchase a media property that influences elections, could acquire a platform that controls how billions of people communicate, could buy political influence that shapes laws and regulations? The answer is obvious to every modern billionaire. The mansion is obsolete. Not because wealth disappeared, not because ambition declined, but because better instruments of power emerged. More effective tools for exercising influence. The Vanderbilts built monuments to themselves that tourists now visit for admission fees. Modern billionaires build systems of control that most people don't even recognize as concentrated power. The wealth is greater. The influence is deeper. The control is more extensive. The visibility is far less. Yet for all this power and influence, the ultra-wealthy still need somewhere to live, still need physical residences. And what they build now, how they approach residential real estate, reveals the final transformation of American elite culture. Mark Zuckerberg's compound on the Hawaiian island of Kauai illustrates the modern fortress mentality perfectly. Beginning in 2014, Zuckerberg and his wife, Priscilla Chan, purchased approximately 700 acres of land on the island's north shore for more than $100 million. The property includes beaches, forests, former plantation land. Beautiful. Remote. In 2016, Zuckerberg began constructing a 6-foot wall around portions of the property. Not a decorative wall, a barrier. Solid. Designed to prevent observation and access. Local residents were outraged, accused him of colonialism, of destroying native Hawaiian access to traditional lands, of acting like a feudal lord. The wall was not about aesthetics. It was about control, about enforcing exclusion. The compound strategy reflects the fortress mentality that defines modern billionaire thinking. Rather than building a palace that welcomes admiration like Biltmore, Zuckerberg constructed a barrier that enforces separation. The contrast could not be more complete. George Vanderbilt built his château on a prominent hilltop, designed the approach road to reveal it dramatically, wanted people to see it, admire it, eventually opened it to tourists. Zuckerberg hides behind walls on a remote island and resents anyone who notices. Larry Ellison took fortress thinking to its absolute extreme, purchasing 98% of Lanai. Geographic isolation as security. You can't casually visit, can't accidentally encounter, can't protest outside the gates because you can't get to the island without permission. Ellison controls access completely. The ranch strategy represents another favored approach. Ted Turner's 2 million acres across multiple western states. John Malone's 2.2 million. These aren't showpiece estates. They're working ranches generating modest income from cattle and bison. The residences are relatively modest, often multiple small buildings rather than single palaces. But the land holdings are enormous, larger than many countries. Turner and Malone control territories, control vast landscapes, control resources, control access. And they do it without building anything that looks like a Gilded Age mansion, without attracting the attention that palaces generate. The conservation framing provides additional benefits, both financial and reputational. Wealthy landowners who place conservation easements on their properties receive substantial tax deductions. The easements restrict future development, protect land in perpetuity, but the owner retains use, can still live there, can still use it for agriculture or limited commercial purposes. Turner has used this strategy extensively, placed conservation easements on hundreds of thousands of acres, protected land forever, while capturing tax benefits worth tens of millions, and getting positive publicity, being celebrated as a conservationist rather than criticized as a billionaire land baron. The doomsday bunker trend reveals something darker about modern billionaire psychology, something that separates them fundamentally from Gilded Age wealth. Since the 2008 financial crisis, survivalist preparation has become increasingly common among Silicon Valley elites. Peter Thiel purchased property in New Zealand, obtained citizenship there, reportedly as insurance against social collapse in the United States, as a bolt hole if things go very wrong. Other tech billionaires have followed similar strategies, buying remote properties in stable countries, obtaining second citizenships, creating escape options. The bunker construction industry has grown to serve this demand. Companies now specialize in converting decommissioned missile silos into luxury underground residences. These facilities feature air filtration systems that can operate for years, independent power generation, extensive food storage, medical facilities, security systems designed to withstand civil unrest or environmental catastrophe. Armored, self-sufficient. Prices range from hundreds of thousands to tens of millions depending on size and specifications. The psychology behind bunker preparation differs fundamentally from Gilded Age mansion building. Profoundly differs. Cornelius Vanderbilt built to display dominance, to show his power, to demonstrate permanence. George Vanderbilt built Biltmore, expecting his fortune and family to endure for generations on that mountain, expecting stability, expecting his wealth to be preserved and respected. Modern billionaires building bunkers expect society to collapse, expect their wealth to provoke violence, expect to need fortified refuges to survive. The shift from palace to fortress to bunker traces a progression, from confidence to anxiety to paranoia, from displaying wealth to hiding it, to preparing to defend it by force. What does that say about modern inequality? About the relationship between the ultra-wealthy and everyone else? The Vanderbilts thought they were building dynasties that would last forever. Modern billionaires are building escape pods for when everything falls apart. Urban anonymity provides yet another strategy, one that's increasingly popular. Ken Griffin, founder of hedge fund Citadel, has purchased multiple floors in Chicago's highest residential buildings rather than building a single mansion. The strategy provides luxury accommodation while avoiding the visibility of a standalone palace. High-rise living offers security through controlled access, professional management, anonymity that comes from living among other wealthy residents. Griffin announced in 2021 that he would relocate Citadel's headquarters from Chicago to Miami, citing concerns about crime in Chicago and Illinois' tax environment. Florida offers no state income tax, lower property taxes, a political climate favorable to business interests. The move illustrates how modern billionaires prioritize tax efficiency and political environment over any particular location or architectural legacy. They're mobile, flexible, willing to move wherever conditions are most favorable. The corporate campus residence represents perhaps the most distinctive modern development. Major technology companies now provide extensive facilities on or near company property, blurring the boundary between work and personal life. Google, Facebook, Apple have developed campuses that include not just offices, but restaurants, fitness facilities, medical services, recreational amenities, and in some cases, residential units. For billionaire founders and executives, the campus effectively becomes a kind of estate. Larry Page and Sergey Brin, Google's founders, spend most of their waking hours on the Google campus or in facilities Google owns. The campus provides everything: food, exercise, healthcare, entertainment, social interaction. Mark Zuckerberg's home in Palo Alto sits minutes from Facebook headquarters. He works from home regularly, making the distinction between residence and office largely semantic. The campus provides security, services, community, everything a traditional estate offered, without the visibility and tax burden of a palace. Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin facility in West Texas illustrates this model at its most extreme. The company's launch site and testing facility sprawls across hundreds of thousands of acres in a remote desert region. Bezos maintains residential facilities on the property, blending workspace with personal retreat. The facility is nominally a commercial aerospace operation, but it also functions as a private domain where Bezos can pursue his space ambitions away from public scrutiny, away from protesters, away from journalists, away from everyone except people he's chosen to be there. Common threads connect these diverse strategies. Every approach prioritizes privacy over display. Every approach seeks to minimize taxation through jurisdiction selection, legal structures, conservation mechanisms. Every approach reflects awareness that visible wealth attracts negative attention. From criminals, from activists, from politicians, from the public. Most importantly, none of these approaches creates anything like Biltmore. No modern billionaire builds a 250-room house meant to be admired by the public and preserved for generations. The ultra-wealthy still control enormous resources, still occupy substantial properties, but they do so in ways designed to hide wealth rather than display it. The mansion as statement of permanence and confidence has been replaced by compounds, ranches, bunkers, and urban anonymity that reflect different psychology entirely. Fear, defensiveness, expectation of social breakdown. The question is whether this transformation represents progress, whether invisible wealth is better than Gilded Age ostentation. The answer depends on what concerns you most about wealth concentration. If the concern is wastefulness, modern efficiency is clearly superior. Billionaires who invest in productive assets rather than building palaces allocate capital more rationally. Society benefits from investments in technology, research, business development. Benefits more than from additional showpiece mansions. If the concern is inequality itself, the comparison is less favorable. Much less favorable. Wealth concentration has increased dramatically, not decreased. The ultra-wealthy control a larger share of total assets than they did in the Gilded Age. The tax system that destroyed mansions has been progressively weakened through lobbying and political influence. Top marginal rates have fallen from 94% to 37%. Estate taxes have been reduced substantially. The system that forced Biltmore to become a museum is weaker now than at any point since the 1920s. If the concern is accountability, modern invisibility creates serious problems. Profound problems. Power that operates through foundations, platforms, and media properties is harder to challenge than power that built visible palaces. Democratic accountability requires visibility, requires knowing who has power and how they're using it. The ultra-wealthy shape education policy through foundations, shape health policy through grant-making, shape environmental policy through funding, shape media discourse through ownership, shape political outcomes through campaign contributions and lobbying. And they do it with minimal public oversight, with limited transparency. Foundations operate in perpetuity with boards controlled by founding families. Platforms control information flow with limited regulation. Media properties influence elections with ownership obscured. The concentration of power has increased, while the visibility of that power has decreased dramatically, making it almost impossible to challenge through normal democratic processes. Biltmore stands as evidence of both what was lost and what was gained. The house is beautiful, genuinely beautiful, impractical, wasteful in many ways, but beautiful, impressive, offensive to some, but culturally valuable to others. It represents an era when wealth built monuments to itself that tourists now pay to see. It demonstrates craftsmanship that modern construction rarely attempts, skills that have largely vanished. It proves that concentrated wealth, however objectionable morally, can create things of lasting aesthetic value. Things that endure, things that millions of people travel to experience. But Biltmore also demonstrates that such monuments cannot be sustained as private residences. George Vanderbilt built his château, intending it to last centuries. To house Vanderbilts for generations, it survives, but only by ceasing to be what he built it to be, only by transforming from private home to public attraction, from family seat to museum, from dynasty headquarters to tourist destination. The house endures by becoming something its builder never intended. The lesson applies beyond architecture, applies to wealth itself. The Gilded Age billionaires built monuments to their wealth. Visible monuments, controversial monuments, monuments that invited democratic response. And the public responded, voted for politicians who promised progressive taxation, supported policies that redistributed wealth, used democratic processes to check concentrated power. The system worked, imperfectly, but it worked. The mansions were destroyed or converted. The fortunes were dispersed through taxation. Extreme inequality was reduced for several decades. Modern billionaires have evolved, learned from the Vanderbilts' mistakes. They don't build palaces that advertise their wealth. They build systems of control that most people don't recognize as concentrated power. They exercise influence through foundations that shape policy, through platforms that control communication, through media properties that influence elections, through political contributions that shape legislation. And they do it invisibly, quietly, with sophistication that makes democratic accountability nearly impossible. Standing on Biltmore's terrace, looking across the Blue Ridge Mountains that George Vanderbilt surveyed more than a century ago, you see a landscape that appears timeless, eternal. The forests have grown, matured. The approach road winds through trees planted generations ago by Olmsted. The view stretches for miles in every direction, mountains fading into distant blue haze. The house still stands, massive, permanent. Proof that skilled craftsmen can create buildings that last centuries. It survives because it transformed, because it adapted, because George's descendants made difficult choices that George himself probably wouldn't have approved, because it became public rather than remaining private, because it opened rather than closing. George Washington Vanderbilt was the least greedy Vanderbilt, the most modest, the most responsible, the most conscientious about using wealth properly. He built Biltmore to demonstrate that enormous wealth could be managed sustainably, that great estates could serve communities, that money could create something beautiful and permanent and meaningful. He was wrong about permanence, completely wrong. The house survives only as museum, only by ceasing to be what he intended. But he was right about something else, something his brothers and cousins never understood. Monuments matter, not because they display wealth, not because they show power, but because they can be seen, challenged, remembered, held accountable. The other Vanderbilts built showpieces and lost everything within 2 generations. George built something that survived. And in surviving, in being open to the public, Biltmore became more valuable than George imagined. It became evidence, proof, documentation of what concentrated wealth looked like when it couldn't hide, when it had to be visible. Every year, over 1 million people walk through these rooms. They photograph the banquet hall with its 70-foot ceiling. They marvel at the library with its painted ceiling from a Venetian palazzo. They stand in the winter garden surrounded by tropical plants in December. They see what $200 million bought in 1895. They see craftsmanship that can't be replicated. They see scale that won't be attempted again. They see what the Gilded Age actually looked like. And maybe, just maybe, they start asking questions. The right questions. The dangerous questions. Where did all that wealth go? Why don't modern billionaires build houses like this? What are they building instead? Where is that money? What does modern wealth look like? And why can't we see it? Those questions matter enormously. Those questions are the beginning of democratic accountability. Those questions are why Biltmore's survival matters more than George Vanderbilt ever imagined. Not as a private home, not as a palace, not as dynasty headquarters, but as public evidence, as documentation, as proof that wealth concentration isn't new, that it can be visible, that when it's visible, it can be challenged, that it can be changed through democratic processes. The mansion didn't survive by staying private. It survived by becoming public, by opening its doors, by letting everyone see. And in that transformation, accidental and desperate and financially motivated as it was, Biltmore became something more valuable than George's private refuge. It became a public record, a monument not to one man's wealth, but to an entire system. A system that built palaces and then destroyed them. A system that concentrated fortunes and then redistributed them through taxation. A system that made inequality visible and therefore made it democratically accountable. That system is gone now, replaced by something quieter, more efficient, more sophisticated, more powerful, and much, much harder to see. The new system concentrates wealth more extremely than the Gilded Age, exercises power more extensively, controls more completely, but it does so invisibly, through foundations that avoid scrutiny, through platforms that shape behavior, through media properties that influence opinion, through political contributions that shape policy. The power is greater, the visibility is less, and what we cannot see, we cannot challenge. Biltmore remains. 4 acres of floor space under one roof, 250 rooms, 65 fireplaces, 43 bathrooms, the largest private residence ever built in America. Still standing, still open, still showing us what we're not allowed to see anymore, still asking questions we need to answer. That's why it matters. That's why it survived. That's why George Vanderbilt, the quiet grandson who loved books and forests and building something beautiful, created the only Vanderbilt legacy that endured. Not because it was the biggest, not because it was the most expensive, not because it was the most elaborate, but because it became visible, public, shared, because it became evidence that wealth concentration exists, that it can be excessive, that it can be challenged, that democracy can respond when power is visible. George built a palace for himself. It survived by becoming a palace for everyone, for all of us. And that transformation, accidental as it was, might be the most important thing about Biltmore's entire story. The mansion that shouldn't exist, built by a fortune that shouldn't have lasted, standing as evidence of an era that can't return, and asking us every day, with every visitor who walks through its doors, with every person who sees those 250 rooms and asks how this was possible. What are the billionaires building now? Where is that wealth? What does that power look like? And why can't we see it anymore? Those questions don't have easy answers, don't have simple solutions. But at least at Biltmore, we can still ask them. At least here, the monument remains. At least for now, we can still see. At least here, there's still evidence, still proof, still a reminder that wealth concentration can be visible, can be known, can be challenged, can be changed. Biltmore stands not as a monument to wealth, but as a monument to visibility, to the idea that what can be seen can be questioned, that what can be questioned can be changed, that democracy requires transparency, that power requires accountability, that we cannot challenge what we cannot see. The mansion survives as warning and reminder. Build palaces, and they invite destruction. Hide your wealth, and it becomes unchallengeable. The first lesson has been learned. The second has been implemented. And we're all living with the consequences, every single day,